The historical Arthur emerges from the turbulent centuries following Rome's withdrawal from Britain in 410 AD, a period when the island's political landscape fractured into competing kingdoms and the very concept of unified resistance against foreign invasion took on legendary proportions. To understand the genesis of the Arthurian legend, we must first examine the Romano-British military leaders who fought desperately to preserve their civilization against the encroaching Saxon tide, men whose deeds would eventually be magnified and mythologized into the figure we recognize today. Ambrosius Aurelianus stands as the most compelling historical candidate for the proto-Arthur figure. Gildas, writing in the mid-6th century in his De Excidio Britanniae, describes Aurelianus as a Roman gentleman whose parents had worn the purple, indicating noble or even imperial connections. This Romano-British war leader organised effective resistance against Saxon expansion during the late 5th century, achieving significant military victories that temporarily halted Germanic settlement in certain regions. Gildas credits Aurelianus with initiating a period of alternating victories and defeats between the Britons and Saxons, culminating in the decisive British victory at Mons Badonicus, though he stops short of naming the commander at that crucial battle. The archaeological record supports the existence of such Romano-British resistance leaders through fortified sites that show continued occupation and strengthening during the post-Roman period. Cadbury Castle in Somerset, long associated with Arthurian tradition, reveals extensive 5th and 6th century refortification. The massive timber-laced ramparts, constructed using Roman engineering techniques adapted for local materials, suggest a leader with both resources and knowledge of military architecture. Excavations have uncovered imported Mediterranean pottery, indicating continued trade connections and wealth, sufficient to maintain international commerce, even as central Roman authority collapsed. The military equipment discovered at these sites reflects the hybrid nature of post-Roman British warfare. Iron spearheads with distinctive Celtic designs appear alongside Roman-style belt fittings and buckles. Sword fragments show evidence of pattern welding techniques, creating blades with serpentine designs that combined functional metallurgy with symbolic meaning. These weapons represent the fusion of Roman military technology with Celtic craftsmanship traditions, embodying the cultural synthesis that characterized Romano-British resistance leaders like Aurelianus. Celtic warrior traditions provided the cultural framework within which these historical figures operated. The concept of the war chief, or Pendragon in Welsh tradition, represented more than simple military leadership. These figures served as focal points for tribal identity, responsible not only for military success but for maintaining the supernatural favour necessary for victory. Celtic kingship operated on principles of personal charisma and demonstrated prowess, rather than hereditary succession alone. A war chief proved his legitimacy through successful raids, the ability to attract and maintain a warband, and the distribution of wealth gained through conquest. The warband system, known in Welsh as the Tulu, formed the core of Celtic military organisation. These professional warriors, bound to their lord through oaths of personal loyalty, lived in the chief's hall and depended entirely on his success for their livelihood. Archaeological evidence from halls like that discovered at Dinas Powys in Wales shows the material culture of such warrior elites. The site yielded fragments of high-quality metalwork, imported glass vessels, and evidence of feasting on a scale that demonstrates the redistribution of wealth necessary to maintain warrior loyalty. The role of the smith held particular significance in Celtic warrior culture, as evidenced by the elaborate metalworking facilities found at major sites. At Cadbury Castle, excavations revealed sophisticated smithing areas with evidence for the production of both weapons and decorative metalwork. The smith occupied a quasi-magical position in Celtic society, transforming raw materials into objects of power. This tradition would later influence Arthurian narratives. where magical swords and the figure of the smith-magician play central roles. Celtic tribal kingship structures operated through complex networks of obligation and alliance, rather than centralized authority. Kings ruled through consent and demonstrated success rather than abstract legitimacy. This system created inherent instability, but also remarkable flexibility in responding to external threats. When faced with Saxon invasion, multiple tribal leaders could theoretically unite under a successful war chief, creating temporary confederations capable of mounting effective resistance. The transition period following Roman withdrawal created unprecedented conditions for the emergence of legendary warrior kings. The collapse of imperial administration left a power vacuum that existing British political structures struggled to fill. Roman military units, the Limitanei, had been stationed along Hadrian's Wall and in strategic locations throughout Britain for centuries. When imperial support ended, these professional soldiers faced a choice between abandoning their posts or adapting to local conditions. Some Roman officers, like Ambrosius Aurelianus, chose to remain and fight for their adopted homeland. These men possessed military training, strategic knowledge, and often significant personal wealth accumulated through service. Their Roman military experience, combined with local knowledge and Celtic political alliances through marriage or adoption, created a unique class of hybrid leaders. They understood both Roman tactical doctrine and Celtic warrior culture, enabling them to organise effective resistance using elements of both traditions. The Saxon invasions, beginning as early as the mid-5th century, initially took the form of raiding parties and mercenary settlements, rather than coordinated conquest. Archaeological evidence from Saxon cemeteries shows a gradual increase in Germanic settlement, with early burials containing distinctly continental grave goods gradually giving way to hybrid Anglo-Saxon material culture. This pattern suggests a process of gradual infiltration and cultural assimilation rather than sudden military conquest. British resistance to Saxon expansion varied significantly by region. In areas with strong Roman infrastructure and continued urban occupation, like Bath and Cirencester, Romano-British culture persisted longer. These cities show evidence of continued maintenance of Roman buildings and infrastructure well into the 6th century. The presence of inscribed stones using Latin formulae and Roman administrative titles suggests that some semblance of imperial government continued at the local level. The fortified hill forts that dot the British landscape provide crucial evidence for understanding the military situation during this period. Sites like South Cadbury, Glastonbury Tor, and Tintagel in Cornwall all show evidence of 5th and 6th century fortification and occupation. These locations were chosen for their defensive advantages, but also for their symbolic significance within existing Celtic territorial systems. Many had been important centres during the Iron Age, suggesting continuity of political and religious authority across the Roman period. Tintagel presents particularly intriguing evidence for high-status occupation during the Arthurian period. Excavations have revealed extensive imports of Mediterranean pottery, wine amphorae, and fine metalwork dating to the 5th and 6th centuries. The sheer quantity and quality of imported goods suggests a centre of considerable wealth and international connections. The site's dramatic coastal location, perched on a rocky promontory connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway, matches descriptions of royal strongholds in later Celtic literature. The settlement patterns revealed through archaeological investigation show a complex hierarchy of sites during the post-Roman period. Major centres like Cadbury Castle controlled territories that included smaller fortified enclosures, undefended settlements, and specialised production sites. This pattern suggests organised political control extending over considerable distances, the kind of territorial authority that would be necessary for mounting effective resistance against Saxon expansion. Weapons and military equipment from this period reflect both continuity with Roman practice and adaptation to changing conditions. Spearheads remain the most common weapon finds, but their design shows evolution from late Roman patterns. The characteristic leaf-shaped blades of the 5th and 6th centuries are larger and more robust than their Roman predecessors, suggesting adaptation for different fighting techniques. Sword finds are rare but significant, often showing evidence of careful maintenance and repair that indicates their high value and symbolic importance. The material culture of post-Roman Britain reveals a society in transition but not in collapse. High-quality metalwork, including elaborate penannular brooches and decorative belt fittings, demonstrates continued craftsmanship traditions. The discovery of imported pottery and glass at major sites indicates maintained trade connections with the Mediterranean world. These findings contradict earlier historical narratives that portrayed post-Roman Britain as descending into barbarism and isolation. Religious changes during this period added another layer of complexity to the political situation. Christianity had taken root during the later Roman period, but Celtic Christian practices developed their own distinctive characteristics. The monastic movement, represented by figures like St. Patrick and St. David, created new centres of literacy and cultural preservation. These Christian communities often occupied strategic locations and accumulated considerable wealth through donations and agricultural production. The interaction between Christian and traditional Celtic religious practices created syncretic traditions that would later influence Arthurian narratives. Sacred sites associated with water, particularly springs and lakes, maintained their religious significance while acquiring Christian associations. The practice of depositing valuable objects in water, documented archaeologically through finds like the Battersea shield and Waterloo helmet from earlier periods, continued into the post-Roman era with Christian ritual objects. The linguistic evidence from this period provides additional insight into the cultural dynamics of post-Roman Britain. Place name studies reveal the complex interaction between Celtic, Latin, and Germanic languages. Many locations show Celtic base names with Latin administrative suffixes, indicating continued use of Roman governmental terminology. The survival of Celtic place names in areas that later became heavily Saxonized suggests that Germanic settlement often involved accommodation with existing populations rather than complete displacement. The transformation of historical Romano-British resistance leaders into the legendary Arthur we recognise today began through the preservation and embellishment of their deeds within Welsh oral traditions, eventually crystallising into written sources that provide our earliest glimpses of the developing legend. These sources, spanning from the 6th to the 9th centuries, reveal how historical memories underwent systematic transformation through generations of bardic recitation, evolving from factual military accounts into heroic narratives that served both entertainment and political purposes within Welsh society. The earliest potential reference to Arthur appears in the elegiac poem known as Wace Gododin, attributed to the Welsh bard Aneurin around 600 AD. This haunting work commemorates the catastrophic defeat of British warriors from the Gododin tribe at the Battle of Catreth, identified with modern Catterick in Yorkshire sometime in the late 6th century. The poem represents one of the oldest surviving works in the Welsh language, preserved in manuscripts that demonstrate the sophisticated literary culture maintained by Celtic Christian monasteries during the early medieval period. Within this litany of fallen heroes, Aneurin includes a brief but significant reference that has sparked centuries of scholarly debate. In describing the prowess of the warrior Gwydir, the poet states that he fed black ravens on the rampart of a fortress, though he was no Arthur. This single line, appearing in what scholars term the B-text of the manuscript, suggests that by 600 AD, Arthur had already become a standard of comparison for exceptional warriors, his martial reputation so well established that other heroes could be measured against his achievements. The manuscript tradition of Wace Gododin presents complex textual problems that illuminate the process by which oral traditions became fixed in written form. The earliest surviving manuscript, known as the Book of Aneurin, dates to approximately 1250 AD, creating a gap of over 6 centuries between composition and preservation. Paleographic analysis reveals that scribes made numerous alterations and additions during successive copying, reflecting the continued vitality of oral tradition even after written preservation began. The Arthur reference appears in sections that some scholars argue represent later interpolations, possibly inserted during the 9th or 10th centuries when Arthur's reputation had achieved greater prominence. The linguistic evidence within Y. Gododin provides crucial insights into the cultural context surrounding early Arthurian references. The poem employs archaic Welsh vocabulary and grammatical structures that demonstrate its antiquity, including terms for military equipment and social relationships that had become obsolete by the time of later medieval Welsh literature. References to specific weapon types, such as the rufrin and catgurn, indicate detailed knowledge of 6th century warfare practices that would have been transmitted through oral tradition by participants or contemporary observers. The geographical references within the poem create a detailed picture of the political landscape in post-Roman northern Britain. Aneurin describes warriors travelling from Edinburgh and the surrounding territories of the Gododin to participate in what appears to have been a coordinated British attempt to halt Saxon expansion into Yorkshire. The poem mentions specific locations, fortifications and territorial boundaries that correspond to archaeological evidence for 6th century political organisation in the region. This geographical precision suggests that the poem preserves genuine historical memories, even if embellished through poetic tradition. The social structure depicted in Wace Gododin reflects the warband culture characteristic of post-Roman Celtic society. Warriors are described as members of elite households, bound to their lords through personal oaths and maintained through the redistribution of wealth gained through warfare and tribute. The poem emphasises the warriors' consumption of mead and wine in their lord's hall, their possession of fine weapons and armour, and their obligations to fight to the death rather than survive defeat. These details correspond closely to archaeological evidence from contemporary high-status sites, lending credibility to the poem's historical framework. The transformation of historical memory into heroic narrative becomes more apparent in the Historia Britonum, a Latin compilation attributed to the Welsh monk Nennius around 830 AD. This work represents the first systematic attempt to create a comprehensive history of the Britons, from their legendary origins to contemporary times, drawing on a variety of sources including earlier chronicles, genealogies and oral traditions. Nennius explicitly states his methodology, explaining that he has made a heap of all that I have found from various authorities, acknowledging the composite nature of his work. The Historia Britonum presents Arthur not as a king but as a dux bellorum, who fought alongside the kings of the Britons against Saxon invaders. This designation reflects genuine historical understanding of late Roman and post-Roman military organisation, where professional commanders often served multiple tribal leaders in coordinating resistance against external threats. The text carefully distinguishes Arthur's role from that of traditional kingship, suggesting access to historical traditions that preserved accurate memories of military hierarchy during the period. Nennius provides the first detailed account of Arthur's military campaigns, listing 12 battles fought against Saxon forces across Britain. These battles span a wide geographical area, from the River Glyne in Lincolnshire to Mount Baden in the south, suggesting either a single commander operating across vast territories or the conflation of multiple historical figures into a composite narrative. The battle locations, where identifiable, correspond to areas of documented Saxon-British conflict during the late 5th and early 6th centuries, indicating that the list preserves genuine historical memories, even if their attribution to a single commander remains questionable. The Battle of Baden Hill receives particular emphasis in Nennius's account, described as Arthur's greatest victory, where he personally killed 960 enemies in a single day. This obviously legendary detail reveals how oral tradition had begun to embellish historical events with supernatural elements by the 9th century. However, the battle's historical significance remains undisputed. Gildas, writing much closer to the events, describes Baden as the decisive British victory that ended Saxon expansion for a generation, though he does not name the British commander. Archaeological evidence supports the historical reality of a major British victory during this period. Saxon settlement patterns show a marked pause in expansion during the early 6th century, with established communities showing signs of consolidation rather than territorial growth. Weapon deposits from this period, found in rivers and sacred sites, include damaged Saxon equipment that may represent trophies from British victories. The distribution of these finds corresponds roughly to the territories described in later sources as being under British control following Baden. The Annales Cambriae, or Welsh Annals, provide the most precise chronological framework for Arthur's career, recording two crucial events with specific dates. The entry for year 72 states, "The Battle of Baden, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were the victors." This entry combines historical fact with Christian symbolism, reflecting the religious context within which these annals were compiled in Welsh monasteries. The chronological precision of the Annales Cambriae reflects the sophisticated timekeeping systems maintained by Celtic Christian communities. These monasteries preserved Roman methods of date calculation while adapting them to local needs, creating comprehensive records that tracked both secular and religious events. The survival of such precise dating for 6th century events demonstrates the continuity of literate culture in Wales, despite the collapse of Roman administrative systems elsewhere in Britain. The second Arthurian entry in the Welsh Annals, placed in year 93, records the Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur and Madraut fell. The laconic nature of this entry, devoid of the triumphant language used for Baden, suggests a disaster for British forces. The inclusion of Madraut, later transformed into the treacherous Mordred of medieval romance, indicates that oral traditions had already begun to develop the internal conflict narrative that would become central to later Arthurian literature. The geographical implications of these dated entries create a coherent picture of Arthur's career spanning approximately 20 years of active military leadership. The gap between Baden and Camlan suggests a period of relative peace following the decisive victory over Saxon forces, during which internal British conflicts may have developed. This pattern corresponds to broader historical trends, where successful war leaders often face challenges from rival British factions once external threats diminished. The preservation of these specific dates and events within Welsh monastic chronicles reflects the broader cultural role of these institutions in maintaining historical memory. Celtic Christian monasteries served as repositories for genealogies, legal traditions, and historical narratives that legitimized contemporary political arrangements. The inclusion of Arthurian material in such records indicates that Arthur's reputation had achieved sufficient political significance by the 8th and 9th centuries to warrant preservation alongside other foundational figures of Welsh identity. Oral bardic traditions provided the primary mechanism through which historical memories of post-Roman resistance leaders were preserved and transformed across generations. The bardic system in Wales maintained remarkable continuity from pre-Roman Celtic culture through the medieval period, adapting to Christian influence while preserving essential functions of cultural transmission. Bards served not merely as entertainers, but as keepers of genealogies, legal precedents, and historical narratives that defined tribal identity and political legitimacy. The training system for Welsh bards required extensive memorization of traditional material, including hundreds of poems, genealogies spanning numerous generations, and complex legal formulations. Archaeological evidence from bardic schools, such as the remains found at Bardsey Island, reveals the material culture supporting this educational system. Excavations have uncovered writing tablets, styluses, and imported manuscripts that demonstrate the integration of oral and written traditions within bardic education. The social status of bards within Welsh society provided both the motivation and means for preserving historical traditions. Court bards enjoyed privileges comparable to those of nobles, receiving grants of land and legal protections that ensured their independence. This elevated status created incentives for maintaining high standards of performance and accuracy, as bardic reputation depended on the perceived authenticity of their historical narratives. The legal codes preserved in medieval Welsh manuscripts specify penalties for bards who deliberately falsified genealogies or historical claims, indicating the serious political consequences of bardic testimony. The performance context of bardic recitation shaped the transformation of historical memory into legendary narrative. Bards performed primarily in the halls of nobles during feasts and ceremonial occasions, adapting their material to suit audience expectations and political circumstances. The competitive nature of these performances, where multiple bards might present different versions of the same events, encouraged elaboration and embellishment while maintaining core narrative elements. Archaeological evidence from excavated halls shows the physical arrangements that supported these performances, including raised platforms for performers and acoustic features that enhanced voice projection. The linguistic evolution of Welsh during the post-Roman period influenced the transmission of Arthurian material through oral tradition. The transition from Brythonic, the common Celtic language of Roman Britain, to distinct Welsh, Cornish and Breton dialects created opportunities for reinterpretation and embellishment as stories crossed linguistic boundaries. Comparative analysis of Arthurian names and terms in different Celtic languages reveals patterns of borrowing and adaptation that illuminate the geographical spread of these traditions. The integration of Christian elements into pre-existing Celtic narrative patterns created the Syncretic tradition that characterises early Welsh Arthurian material. Christian monasteries provided venues for the interaction between bardic oral tradition and Latin literary culture, producing hybrid narratives that combined Celtic heroic ideals with Christian moral frameworks. The physical evidence for this cultural synthesis appears in decorated manuscripts like the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels, which employ Celtic artistic motifs in Christian contexts. The political functions of Arthurian tradition within early medieval Wales extended beyond mere entertainment to encompass legitimisation of contemporary rulers and territorial claims. Welsh genealogies preserved in manuscripts like the Harleian collection trace the descent of medieval Welsh princes from Arthur and other legendary figures, creating historical justifications for political authority. The geographical distribution of Arthurian place names across Wales correlates with territories controlled by dynasties claiming Arthurian descent, suggesting systematic use of legendary associations to support territorial claims. The material culture associated with bardic performance provides archaeological evidence for the social context that shaped Arthurian oral tradition. Excavations at royal sites like Lys Rosir in Anglesey have revealed specialised buildings designed for ceremonial gatherings, including halls with acoustic properties optimised for spoken performance. The discovery of high-quality musical instruments, decorated drinking vessels, and imported luxury goods at these sites demonstrates the wealth and sophistication of the courts that patronised bardic culture. The seasonal cycle of bardic performance influenced the development and preservation of Arthurian narratives. Winter months, when agricultural work diminished and communities gathered indoors, provided extended opportunities for lengthy narrative performances. The archaeological record shows evidence for increased consumption of imported wine and luxury foods during winter months at high-status sites, suggesting elaborate feasting occasions that would have featured bardic entertainment. These extended performance contexts allowed for the development of complex narrative cycles that could span multiple evenings. The relationship between bardic tradition and written preservation becomes evident in the manuscript evidence for early Welsh literature. Scribes working in monastic scriptoria often preserved multiple versions of the same narrative, reflecting different oral traditions or performance variants. The Red Book of Hergest and the White Book of Rutherk contain parallel versions of Arthurian tales that show systematic variations in detail while maintaining consistent core narratives, demonstrating the flexibility inherent in oral tradition even after written preservation began. The manuscript traditions preserved in medieval Welsh collections represent the culmination of centuries of oral development, transforming the scattered references and chronicle entries of earlier sources into fully realised narrative cycles that established Arthur as the central figure of British heroic literature. The four branches of the Mabinogi, compiled in their surviving form during the 11th and 12th centuries, preserve ancient Celtic mythological patterns while incorporating Arthurian material that had achieved canonical status within Welsh literary tradition. These tales, recorded in manuscripts such as the White Book of Rutherk and the Red Book of Hergest, demonstrate the sophisticated narrative techniques employed by Welsh storytellers to weave together historical memory, mythological themes, and contemporary political concerns. The tale of Culhwch and Olwen stands as the earliest complete Arthurian narrative in Welsh literature, presenting Arthur's court as a fully established institution, populated by heroes whose names and attributes reflect deep roots in Celtic tradition. Unlike later medieval romances that would transform Arthur into a passive monarch presiding over chivalric adventures, this Welsh tale portrays him as an active warrior king whose supernatural strength and martial prowess remain central to his character. The narrative opens with Culhwch's arrival at Arthur's court, seeking assistance in winning Olwen, daughter of the giant Ysbyddaden Bencawr, establishing the pattern of supplicants approaching Arthur for aid that would become fundamental to later Arthurian literature. The physical description of Arthur's court in Culhwch and Olwen reflects archaeological evidence for high-status settlements in early medieval Wales, while incorporating fantastical elements that elevate the setting beyond historical reality. The hall is described as capable of accommodating hundreds of warriors, with elaborate decorative features including carved pillars and precious metal fittings that correspond to luxury items discovered at sites like Lys Roser and Aberfraw. The presence of specific architectural details, such as the great gate that requires multiple men to open and the raised dais where Arthur holds court, demonstrates familiarity with actual royal residences while magnifying their scale to heroic proportions. Arthur's retinue in this tale includes figures whose names appear in earlier Welsh genealogies and poetry, indicating the systematic incorporation of traditional heroic material into Arthurian narrative. Ser, known in later tradition as Sir Kay, appears as Arthur's foster brother and chief warrior, possessing supernatural abilities including the power to hold his breath underwater for 9 days and nights and to extend his height at will. These magical attributes reflect Celtic mythological patterns where heroes possess otherworldly powers that distinguish them from ordinary mortals, connecting Arthurian tradition to broader Indo-European heroic archetypes. Bedwyr, later transformed into Sir Bedivere in continental romance, serves as Arthur's chief companion and spear-bearer, described as the finest warrior in Britain despite having only one hand. His disability, far from diminishing his status, enhances his heroic reputation by demonstrating that skill and courage transcend physical limitations. The specific mention of his missing hand connects to Celtic traditions of wounded heroes, such as the Irish King Nuada of the Silver Hand, suggesting deliberate incorporation of mythological motifs into Arthurian character development. The quest structure of Culhwch and Olwen establishes patterns that would influence all subsequent Arthurian literature, combining the Celtic tradition of impossible tasks with the practical requirements of narrative coherence. His Bedard Bencowr sets 40 impossible conditions for Culhwch's marriage to his daughter, each requiring the assistance of specific heroes with particular skills or magical objects. This framework allows the narrator to showcase the diverse talents of Arthur's warriors, while demonstrating the king's ability to coordinate complex undertakings that span vast geographical areas and involve supernatural challenges. The tasks themselves reflect deep knowledge of Celtic mythology and folklore, incorporating elements such as the hunting of magical boars, the retrieval of objects from the other world, and the completion of agricultural labours that require supernatural assistance. The hunt for the great boar Ysgithewin Bed represents a particularly significant episode, connecting Arthurian tradition to ancient Celtic hunting myths, while providing opportunities for displays of martial prowess by Arthur and his companions. The boar's supernatural size and ferocity, described as capable of devastating entire territories, elevate the hunt beyond ordinary activity into a cosmic struggle between order and chaos. The geographical scope of the adventures in Culhwch and Olwen encompasses not only Wales but Ireland, Cornwall, and other Celtic territories, reflecting the political and cultural connections that link these regions during the early medieval period. Specific locations mentioned in the tale, such as the court of the Irish king Mythology and the fortress of the giant Ernach, correspond to places that appear in other branches of the Mabinogi and in Irish literary tradition, indicating shared narrative cycles that crossed political boundaries through bardic networks. Arthur's personal involvement in the quest activities distinguishes this early Welsh portrayal from later continental traditions, where he becomes increasingly passive. The king participates directly in combat against giants and monsters, leads hunting expeditions across treacherous terrain, and employs his own magical abilities to overcome supernatural obstacles. His ship Prydwen, his shield Vineb Gurthwcher, and his sword Culhwch possess individual identities and powers that make them characters in their own right rather than mere equipment, reflecting Celtic traditions where weapons and tools possessed spiritual significance. The supernatural elements woven throughout Culhwch and Olwen demonstrate the integration of pre-Christian Celtic religious concepts with the heroic narrative framework. Characters routinely travel between the mortal world and the other world, encounter talking animals who serve as guides and allies, and manipulate natural forces through magical means. The giant Ysbyddaden himself represents a figure from Celtic mythology, embodying the chaotic forces that heroes must overcome to establish civilized order, his eventual death marking the triumph of Arthur's organized society over primordial threats. The social structure depicted in the tale reflects early medieval Welsh political organisation, while incorporating idealised elements that serve narrative purposes. Arthur's court operates as a confederation of semi-independent heroes who maintain their own territories and followers, while acknowledging the king's supreme authority in matters requiring coordinated action. This arrangement corresponds to historical evidence for Welsh political organisation during the 9th and 10th centuries, where regional princes maintained autonomy while participating in larger confederations under high kings during times of external threat. The role of women in Culhwch and Olwen follows patterns established in earlier Celtic literature, while introducing elements that would influence later Arthurian tradition. Olwen herself, whose name means white track, in reference to the white flowers that spring up wherever she walks, embodies the Celtic goddess of sovereignty whose marriage legitimizes royal authority. Her supernatural beauty and the magical effects of her presence connect her to otherworld figures who appear throughout Celtic mythology as arbiters of kingship and sources of royal power. The narrative techniques employed in Culhwch and Olwen reveal sophisticated understanding of audience expectations and literary convention. The extensive catalogues of heroes, weapons, and magical objects serve both practical and aesthetic purposes, providing repositories of traditional material while creating rhythmic patterns that aid memorization and oral performance. The repetitive formulaic language used to describe recurring actions, such as the arrival of messengers or the preparation for combat, reflects oral composition techniques while creating structural unity across episodic adventures. Welsh poetry contemporary with the prose tales provides additional evidence for Arthur's established position within Celtic literary tradition. The poems attributed to Taliesin, whether historically composed by the 6th century bard or created by later poets working in his tradition, present Arthur as a figure of already legendary status, whose deeds serve as standards of comparison for contemporary rulers. The poem Prydiw Anufien describes Arthur's expedition to the otherworld fortress of Anufrin to retrieve a magical cauldron, establishing themes of otherworld adventure and the quest for supernatural objects that would become central to later Arthurian literature. The cauldron itself represents one of the most significant magical objects in Celtic tradition, possessing the power to restore the dead to life while providing inexhaustible food for worthy recipients. Its otherworld location and the tremendous casualties suffered by Arthur's expedition to retrieve it emphasise the cosmic significance of the quest, positioning Arthur as a figure capable of challenging the fundamental boundaries between life and death, mortal and divine realms. The poem's statement that only 7 men returned from the expedition of 3 shipfuls demonstrates the terrible cost of such supernatural adventures while highlighting the exceptional nature of those who survived. The Welsh triads, collections of traditional material organised into groups of 3 for mnemonic purposes, provide systematic evidence for Arthur's canonical status within Celtic literary tradition. These triads categorise Arthur among the 3 generous men of the island of Britain, the 3 red ravagers, and other significant groupings that establish his position among the greatest figures of British legend. The triadic format itself reflects ancient Celtic educational and legal traditions, where complex information was organised into memorable patterns that facilitated oral transmission across generations. The specific triads mentioning Arthur reveal different aspects of his legendary character, while connecting him to other traditional figures. His inclusion among the 3 generous men emphasises his role as a distributor of wealth and patron of warriors, reflecting the economic functions of early medieval kingship where rulers maintained authority through the redistribution of resources gained through warfare and tribute. The archaeological evidence for feasting and gift-giving at high-status sites supports this portrayal, showing the material basis for the generous kingship idealised in literary tradition. Arthur's categorisation among the 3 red ravagers presents a more aggressive aspect of his character, emphasising his role as a destroyer of enemies and bringer of devastation to opposing forces. This martial characterisation aligns with his portrayal in early Welsh sources as an active military leader rather than the passive monarch of later Romance tradition. The specific mention of his red nature connects him to Celtic colour symbolism, where red represented both martial prowess and otherworld power, suggesting supernatural as well as military authority. The relationship between Welsh Arthurian tales and broader Celtic mythology becomes apparent through comparative analysis of narrative motifs, character types, and supernatural elements that appear across different literary traditions. The theme of the wasteland, where the king's physical condition affects the fertility of his realm, connects Arthurian tradition to ancient Indo-European concepts of sacred kingship, while appearing in various forms throughout Celtic literature. The Irish tale of the Dagda's cauldron, the Welsh story of Bran's life-restoring vessel, and the Arthurian Grail tradition all reflect variations on this fundamental mythological pattern. The otherworld journeys that feature prominently in Welsh Arthurian literature follow established Celtic narrative patterns while adapting them to specifically Arthurian contexts. The Irish tradition of the Voyage of Brain, the Welsh tale of Pwll's adventures in Anufren, and Arthur's expedition to retrieve the cauldron from the Otherworld fortress all employ similar structural elements, including supernatural guides, tests of worthiness, and the acquisition of magical objects that enhance the hero's power in the mortal world. These parallels indicate shared mythological frameworks that transcended political boundaries within the Celtic cultural sphere. The magical animals that appear throughout Welsh Arthurian tales connect to ancient Celtic religious traditions, where certain creatures served as intermediaries between mortal and divine realms. The great boars hunted by Arthur and his companions represent more than challenging quarry. They embody chaotic forces that threaten civilized order and must be overcome through heroic action. The specific boar Torc Traeth, whose hunt spans multiple countries and requires the coordination of numerous heroes, represents a cosmic adversary whose defeat demonstrates Arthur's ability to organize resistance against supernatural threats. The transformation themes that appear in Welsh Arthurian literature reflect Celtic religious concepts concerning the fluidity of identity and the permeable boundaries between different states of being. Characters routinely change shape, travel between worlds, and assume multiple identities without losing their essential nature, indicating worldviews that emphasize spiritual rather than physical reality as the foundation of personal identity. These transformative elements would later influence continental Arthurian romance, while retaining distinctly Celtic characteristics in their Welsh literary contexts. The integration of Christian elements into pre-existing Celtic mythological frameworks created the syncretic tradition that characterizes mature Welsh Arthurian literature. Arthur's role as a Christian king fighting pagan enemies provides religious justification for his military activities, while maintaining the supernatural elements that distinguished him from ordinary historical rulers. The specific mention of his carrying the cross of Christ during the Battle of Badon, recorded in the Welsh annals, demonstrates the systematic Christianization of earlier pagan heroic traditions without entirely eliminating their non-Christian characteristics. The monastic context within which these tales were preserved and transmitted influenced their development while maintaining essential Celtic narrative patterns. Scribes working in Welsh monasteries possessed both classical Latin education and deep knowledge of vernacular tradition, enabling them to create sophisticated literary works that combined Christian moral frameworks with traditional heroic values. The manuscript evidence shows careful attention to linguistic detail and narrative consistency that indicates professional literary production rather than casual preservation of folk material. The transformation of Arthur from a Welsh war leader celebrated in bardic halls into a European conqueror whose empire rivaled Rome itself occurred through the revolutionary work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, whose Historia Regum Britanniae fundamentally altered the scope and character of Arthurian legend. Written around 1136 during the reign of Henry I, Geoffrey's chronicle presented itself as a comprehensive history of British kings from the Trojan settlement of Britain through the Saxon conquest, positioning Arthur as the greatest monarch in this legendary lineage, while dramatically expanding his geographical reach and political significance beyond anything found in earlier Welsh sources. Geoffrey's methodology represented a radical departure from the careful chronicle tradition established by earlier historians, like Bede and the compilers of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Where these earlier works distinguished between documented events and legendary material, Geoffrey systematically blended historical chronicles, Welsh oral traditions, classical literary models, and what appears to be substantial invention into a seamless narrative that claimed equal historical authority for all its components. His prologue explicitly states that he undertook the work because the deeds of British kings had been neglected by previous historians, positioning himself as the discoverer and transmitter of previously unknown historical material rather than as a creative author. The sources Geoffrey claimed to have consulted present one of the most enduring puzzles in medieval literary scholarship. he repeatedly references a very ancient book written in the British language, given to him by Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, which supposedly contained the complete history of British kings from Brutus to Cadwallader. No such manuscript has ever been identified, despite Geoffrey's insistence that it provided the foundation for his entire work. Modern scholarship suggests that this mysterious source served as a literary device to legitimise Geoffrey's extensive additions to the historical record, allowing him to present innovative material as ancient tradition while deflecting criticism about his departures from established chronicle evidence. The genuine sources Geoffrey did employ reveal his sophisticated understanding of available historical and literary traditions. His work demonstrates familiarity with Gildas's De Excidio Britanniae, Bede's Ecclesiastical History, the Historia Brittonum attributed to Nennius, and the Welsh Annals, along with classical authors including Livy, Virgil and Lucan. Archaeological evidence from the library at Glastonbury Abbey, where Geoffrey may have conducted research, shows collections of manuscripts that would have provided access to both Latin, historical works and Welsh vernacular traditions, supporting the possibility that he worked from genuine early sources even while transforming their content beyond recognition. Geoffrey's portrayal of Arthur's conception and birth introduced the figure of Merlin as a central character in Arthurian tradition, fundamentally altering the legend's supernatural framework while drawing on Welsh traditions concerning the prophet Myrddin. The elaborate deception orchestrated by Merlin to enable Uther Pendragon's seduction of Igerna, wife of Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall, established patterns of magical intervention in royal succession that would influence all subsequent Arthurian literature. Geoffrey's Merlin possesses powers that extend far beyond the prophetic abilities attributed to his Welsh predecessor, demonstrating mastery over natural forces, the ability to transport massive stone monuments across vast distances, and knowledge of future events that spans generations. The Stonehenge episode, where Merlin transports the Giant's Ring from Ireland to Salisbury Plain as a memorial for British nobles slain by Saxon treachery, demonstrates Geoffrey's technique of incorporating existing monuments into his historical narrative while providing supernatural explanations for their construction. Archaeological evidence shows that Stonehenge was constructed over millennia beginning in the Neolithic period, but Geoffrey's account provided medieval audiences with a comprehensible origin story that connected the monument to their contemporary political concerns. The specific details of the transportation, involving ships, mechanical devices, and ultimately magical intervention, when conventional methods fail, reflect genuine medieval understanding of engineering challenges while emphasizing Merlin's supernatural abilities. Arthur's coronation, as described by Geoffrey, established the template for medieval royal ceremony, while incorporating elements that elevated the new king above ordinary monarchs. The ceremony takes place at Caerleon upon Usk, which Geoffrey describes as one of Britain's greatest cities, possessing 2 churches, a college of 200 philosophers, and astronomical observatories that rival those of ancient Alexandria. Archaeological excavations at Caerleon have revealed substantial Roman remains, including an amphitheatre, legionary fortress, and civilian settlement that would have been visible in Geoffrey's time, providing physical evidence for the site's former grandeur that supported his claims about its continuing importance. The crown worn by Arthur during his coronation receives detailed description that reflects contemporary understanding of royal regalia, while incorporating supernatural elements that distinguish it from earthly crowns. Geoffrey describes it as made of gold and precious stones, but emphasises its otherworldly origins and the prophetic significance of its decorative elements. The crown's ability to enhance the wearer's authority and its role in legitimising Arthur's rule over not only Britain but eventually continental territories establishes the supernatural foundation for his expanded imperial ambitions. Geoffrey's account of Arthur's military campaigns represents the most dramatic expansion of Arthurian tradition, transforming the Welsh war leader, who fought Saxon invaders into a conqueror whose empire extended across Western Europe. The systematic conquest of Ireland, Iceland, Norway and Denmark provides Arthur with a northern European empire that serves as the foundation for his later continental ambitions. These campaigns receive detailed tactical descriptions that demonstrate Geoffrey's familiarity with medieval warfare, while incorporating supernatural elements that explain Arthur's consistent success against overwhelming odds. The Irish campaign illustrates Geoffrey's narrative technique of combining plausible military details with fantastic elaborations. Arthur's invasion force crosses the Irish Sea in a fleet described with specific numbers of ships and troop dispositions that reflect contemporary military planning, but the ease of conquest and the supernatural terror inspired by Arthur's reputation transform the campaign into something beyond ordinary warfare. The Irish king Gillemurius submits immediately upon learning of Arthur's approach, recognising the futility of resistance against a monarch whose previous victories had achieved legendary status throughout the Celtic world. The Norwegian expedition demonstrates Arthur's ability to project military power across vast distances, while maintaining the loyalty and effectiveness of his forces under extreme conditions. Geoffrey's description of the northern seas, with their treacherous currents and harsh weather conditions, reflects genuine geographical knowledge while emphasising the extraordinary nature of Arthur's achievements. The Norwegian king Sichelm's decision to submit rather than face Arthur in battle establishes a pattern where Arthur's reputation precedes his physical presence, creating an empire maintained as much through psychological dominance as military force. Arthur's continental campaigns represent the culmination of Geoffrey's imperial vision, positioning the British king as a legitimate challenger to Roman authority and the rightful heir to Western European hegemony. The invasion of Gaul begins as a response to Roman demands for tribute, transforming Arthur from a defensive war leader protecting Britain against foreign invasion into an aggressive conqueror claiming ancestral rights over territories once ruled by his predecessors. Geoffrey's detailed account of the Gallic campaign includes specific battle locations, troop movements, and tactical innovations that demonstrate sophisticated military planning while maintaining the supernatural elements that distinguish Arthur from ordinary commanders. The Battle of Saucy, where Arthur defeats the Roman forces led by Lucius Hiberius, represents the climactic military achievement of Geoffrey's Arthurian narrative. The battle description employs classical literary models, particularly Lucan's account of the Battle of Pharsalus, while adapting them to medieval military conditions and Arthurian supernatural elements. Arthur's personal combat prowess, demonstrated through his slaughter of hundreds of enemies with his sword Caliburn, combines Celtic heroic traditions with classical epic conventions to create a hybrid literary form that would influence all subsequent medieval military narratives. The geographical scope of Arthur's empire as described by Geoffrey encompasses territories that correspond to contemporary political ambitions, while exceeding any historical precedent for British imperial expansion. The systematic conquest of Gaul, with detailed accounts of sieges, diplomatic negotiations and administrative arrangements, reflects Geoffrey's understanding of how medieval kingdoms actually functioned, while projecting these realistic elements onto an impossibly vast scale. The specific mention of tribute arrangements, hostage exchanges, and territorial divisions demonstrates familiarity with contemporary diplomatic practices. Geoffrey's political motivations in writing during the reign of Henry I become apparent through analysis of the contemporary parallels between Arthur's empire and Norman territorial ambitions. Henry's own claims over Normandy, his military campaigns in France, and his efforts to establish English hegemony over Wales and Scotland find reflection in Arthur's systematic conquest of neighbouring territories. The legitimization of aggressive expansion through claims of ancestral right, the emphasis on superior military organisation and leadership, and the portrayal of resistance as futile defiance of natural order all serve contemporary Norman political interests. The Anglo-Norman audience for Geoffrey's work possessed both the cultural background to appreciate classical literary references and the political interests that made Arthurian imperial success appealing. The Norman conquest of England had created a ruling class with territorial interests spanning the English Channel, making Arthur's European empire a relevant model for contemporary ambitions. The specific emphasis on Arthur's continental campaigns, rather than his defence of Britain against Saxon invasion, reflects the priorities of an audience more concerned with projecting power outward than with preserving insular independence. Geoffrey's treatment of Merlin's prophecies provides crucial insight into the work's contemporary political functions. The extensive prophetic section, presented as Merlin's response to Vortigern's inquiry about the meaning of the fighting dragons discovered beneath his fortress, offers a comprehensive overview of British history from the 5th century through Geoffrey's own time and beyond. The prophecies employ deliberately obscure symbolic language that allows for multiple interpretations while providing apparent historical validation for contemporary political arrangements. The dragon symbolism employed throughout Merlin's prophecies connects to heraldic traditions that were becoming standardised during Geoffrey's lifetime. The red dragon representing the Britons and the white dragon symbolising the Saxons establish colour-coded identities that correspond to contemporary heraldic practices while providing a framework for understanding the entire sweep of British history as a cosmic struggle between opposing forces. The eventual triumph of the red dragon, prophesied to occur through Arthur's victories, legitimises British resistance to Saxon rule while suggesting that Norman conquest represents the fulfilment of ancient prophecy. The relationship between Geoffrey's Merlin and earlier Welsh traditions concerning Myrddin demonstrates his systematic adaptation of existing material to serve new narrative purposes. The Welsh Myrddin appears in poetry and prose as a prophet driven mad by witnessing the Battle of Arthderid, living as a wild man in the Caledonian forest while uttering cryptic prophecies about future events. Geoffrey transforms this tragic figure into a powerful magician whose supernatural abilities enable Arthur's rise to power while providing historical legitimacy through prophetic validation of contemporary political arrangements. The architectural descriptions in Geoffrey's chronicle reflect contemporary Norman building projects while projecting them onto an impossibly grand scale that emphasises Arthur's imperial status. The rebuilding of cities, construction of fortifications, and establishment of religious foundations described throughout Arthur's reign correspond to actual Norman construction activities in England and Normandy, but their scale and magnificence exceed any historical precedent. Caerleon's transformation into a city rivaling Rome, complete with universities and observatories, provides a British cultural centre that can compete with continental intellectual achievements. The Round Table, introduced by Geoffrey as a diplomatic solution to precedence disputes among Arthur's nobles, demonstrates his understanding of contemporary court protocol while creating an idealised model for aristocratic cooperation. The table's circular shape eliminates traditional hierarchical seating arrangements, allowing all participants to claim equal status while acknowledging Arthur's supreme authority as the figure who makes such equality possible. This innovation addresses practical problems of medieval court organisation, while creating a powerful symbol of unified purpose that would become central to later Arthurian tradition. Geoffrey's account of Arthur's final campaign and death transforms the internal British conflicts recorded in earlier sources into a cosmic struggle between order and chaos. Mordred's rebellion, supported by Saxon and Pictish forces, represents not merely personal treachery, but the breakdown of the imperial system that Arthur had established through supernatural authority and military prowess. The Battle of Camlan receives treatment that emphasises its significance as the end of an age, rather than simply another military engagement, with supernatural portents and divine interventions that mark the conclusion of Arthur's earthly mission. The mysterious circumstances of Arthur's departure to Avalon for the healing of his wounds provide Geoffrey with a conclusion that maintains Arthur's legendary status, while explaining his absence from contemporary political arrangements. The island of Avalon, described as a realm where supernatural healing is possible and time operates according to different principles than in the mortal world, draws on Celtic otherworld traditions, while creating possibilities for Arthur's eventual return that would influence centuries of subsequent political and literary speculation. Geoffrey's chronicle established narrative patterns and character relationships that would dominate Arthurian literature for centuries, while serving immediate political purposes within Anglo-Norman society. The transformation of Welsh oral traditions into Latin literary form made Arthurian material accessible to continental audiences while legitimising Norman territorial ambitions through historical precedent. The systematic expansion of Arthur's geographical reach and political authority created a model for imperial expansion that exceeded classical precedents while remaining grounded in recognisable historical and geographical frameworks. The manuscript tradition of the Historia Regum Britanniae demonstrates its immediate popularity and continued influence throughout the medieval period. Over 200 surviving manuscripts indicate widespread circulation among both clerical and secular audiences, with variant readings that suggest active engagement with Geoffrey's text rather than passive transmission. The rapid translation into vernacular languages, beginning with Wace's French verse adaptation in 1155, demonstrates the work's appeal beyond its original Latin reading audience, while facilitating its influence on developing vernacular literary traditions across Western Europe. Geoffrey of Monmouth's revolutionary chronicle achieved immediate and widespread success across medieval Europe, fundamentally altering how audiences understood British history while establishing Arthur as a figure of international significance. The manuscript evidence reveals the extraordinary speed with which the Historia Regum Britanniae spread throughout Western Europe, with copies appearing in monastic libraries, royal courts, and cathedral schools within decades of its completion. The work's reception varied considerably across different cultural contexts, with each region adapting Geoffrey's material to serve local political and literary needs, while maintaining the core narrative that positioned Arthur as Europe's greatest medieval monarch. The translation movement that began almost immediately after Geoffrey's work appeared demonstrates both its popularity and its perceived historical authority. Continental scribes and translators treated the Historia not as a work of imaginative literature, but as a legitimate historical source that filled crucial gaps in existing chronicle traditions. The systematic copying and circulation of the text through established networks of monastic libraries and cathedral schools indicates that learned audiences accepted Geoffrey's claims about recovering lost British historical material, despite the obvious discrepancies between his account and earlier established sources. The political implications of Geoffrey's expanded Arthurian narrative resonated particularly strongly in regions where Norman territorial ambitions intersected with existing local traditions. In Normandy itself, the portrayal of Arthur's continental conquests provided historical precedent for contemporary ducal claims over territories in France, while the emphasis on legitimate succession through conquest offered ideological support for Norman expansion. The specific details of Arthur's administrative arrangements in conquered territories, including his establishment of loyal governors and systematic extraction of tribute, reflected contemporary Norman practices while projecting them onto a much grander historical scale. French reception of Geoffrey's work occurred within the context of increasingly sophisticated vernacular literary culture, centred around aristocratic courts that patronised both historical chronicles and emerging romance traditions. The Norman French dialect had already established itself as a literary language capable of sophisticated narrative expression, making it natural for translators to adapt Geoffrey's Latin prose into vernacular verse forms that would appeal to secular audiences. The cultural prestige associated with Arthurian material combined with its entertainment value, created demand for French adaptations that would make the stories accessible to noble audiences who preferred vernacular literature to Latin chronicles. Wace's Roman de Brut, completed around 1155 under the patronage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, represents the first major vernacular adaptation of Geoffrey's Chronicle and introduces innovations that would fundamentally alter subsequent Arthurian tradition. Writing in Anglo-Norman French octosyllabic verse, Wace transformed Geoffrey's prose chronicle into a sophisticated literary work that combined historical narrative with courtly entertainment, creating a hybrid form that influenced both chronicle writing and romance literature throughout the medieval period. His adaptation demonstrates sophisticated understanding of contemporary audience expectations, while introducing original elements that expanded the legendary framework established by Geoffrey. The most significant innovation introduced by Wace involves the Round Table, which Geoffrey had mentioned only briefly as a solution to precedence disputes among Arthur's nobles. Wace elaborates this concept into a central symbol of Arthurian court culture, describing the table's construction, its symbolic significance, and its role in creating the idealized fellowship that would become fundamental to later Arthurian literature. His description emphasizes the table's role in eliminating hierarchical distinctions among the knights while maintaining Arthur's supreme authority, creating a model of aristocratic cooperation that reflected contemporary ideals of courtly behaviour. Wace's Round Table serves multiple literary and political functions that extend far beyond Geoffrey's practical solution to seating arrangements. The circular form eliminates traditional precedence disputes, while creating a sacred space where knights can demonstrate their worthiness through deeds rather than inherited status. This meritocratic element appealed to audiences in an era when social mobility through military service was becoming increasingly important, particularly within Norman society, where successful warriors could achieve significant advancement through loyal service to their lords. The physical description of the Round Table in Wace's account reflects contemporary understanding of luxury craftsmanship, while incorporating symbolic elements that elevate it beyond ordinary furniture. Constructed from precious woods with elaborate inlaid decorations depicting scenes from British history, the table serves as both functional object and historical monument, connecting Arthur's contemporary achievements to the legendary past while providing a focal point for court ceremonies. The specific mention of skilled craftsmen brought from across Arthur's empire to create the table demonstrates the international scope of his authority, while emphasizing the cultural sophistication of his court. The fellowship created around the Round Table introduces concepts of knightly behaviour that would become central to medieval chivalric literature. Wace describes the knight's commitment to protecting the innocent, defending the church, and maintaining justice throughout Arthur's realm, establishing behavioural standards that reflect contemporary aristocratic ideals while projecting them onto the legendary past. These chivalric obligations create narrative frameworks for individual adventures, while maintaining connection to the central Arthurian court, allowing for episodic storytelling that could accommodate multiple heroes and diverse adventures. Wace's expansion of courtly culture within Arthur's realm reflects the sophisticated aristocratic society that had developed around major Norman and Angevin courts during the 12th century. The detailed descriptions of tournaments, feasts, and ceremonial occasions demonstrate familiarity with contemporary court practices, while magnifying their scale and magnificence to match Arthur's legendary status. The presence of ladies at court events, their role in inspiring knightly deeds, and their participation in courtly entertainment establish patterns of aristocratic behaviour that would influence both literature and actual court culture throughout the medieval period. The geographical expansion of Arthurian influence in Wace's adaptation extends Geoffrey's imperial vision while providing more detailed descriptions of the administrative and cultural arrangements that maintained Arthur's European empire. The systematic establishment of round tables in major cities throughout the conquered territories creates a network of Arthurian courts that spread chivalric ideals while maintaining political unity through shared symbolic frameworks. This innovation allows for adventures and characters from across Europe to be incorporated into Arthurian narrative, while maintaining thematic coherence through common chivalric values. The linguistic innovations introduced by Wace demonstrate the adaptation of Arthurian material to vernacular literary traditions, while maintaining the historical authority established by Geoffrey's Latin Chronicle. The octosyllabic verse form employed throughout the Roman de Brut reflects contemporary preferences in French narrative poetry, while allowing for the systematic development of character relationships and thematic elements that prose chronicle format could not accommodate as effectively. The specific vocabulary chosen to describe knightly activities, courtly ceremonies, and military encounters established French terminology that would influence Arthurian literature throughout Europe. The manuscript tradition of Wace's Roman de Brut reveals its immediate popularity among aristocratic audiences, while demonstrating the active engagement of scribes and readers with the text. Surviving manuscripts contain marginalia, corrections, and additions that indicate careful reading and comparison with other sources, suggesting that medieval audiences treated Wace's adaptation as a legitimate historical work rather than mere entertainment. The presence of elaborate illuminated initials, decorative borders, and miniature illustrations in luxury manuscripts indicates patronage by wealthy noble families who valued Arthurian material sufficiently to commission expensive decorated copies. The political context of Wace's writing during the reign of Henry II provides crucial insight into the contemporary functions of his Arthurian adaptations. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine had created an Angevin empire that extended from Scotland to the Pyrenees, making Arthur's continental conquests a relevant model for contemporary territorial arrangements. The emphasis on legitimate succession, the benefits of unified rule under a strong monarch, and the cultural superiority demonstrated through chivalric institutions all served Angevin political interests, while providing entertainment for aristocratic audiences. Layamon's Brut, composed around 1200 in Middle English alliterative verse, represents a fundamental transformation of Arthurian material from its French courtly context into English literary tradition, while introducing innovations that would influence subsequent development of the legend. Working primarily from Wace's French adaptation rather than directly from Geoffrey's Latin original, Layamon created a work that combined Anglo-Saxon poetic traditions with continental Arthurian material, producing a hybrid literary form that reflected the complex cultural situation in post-Norman conquest England. His adaptation demonstrates sophisticated understanding of both English poetic technique and French narrative content, while introducing original elements that expanded the legendary framework. The linguistic significance of Layamon's Brut extends beyond its role in Arthurian tradition to encompass its position as one of the earliest substantial works in Middle English literature. The alliterative verse form employed throughout the work connects to Anglo-Saxon poetic traditions, while incorporating vocabulary and narrative techniques derived from French sources, creating a literary language that reflects the cultural synthesis occurring in medieval England. The specific dialect employed, identified as West Midland Middle English, provides crucial evidence for the development of English literary language during the transitional period following the Norman conquest. Layamon's expansion of Arthur's birth narrative introduces supernatural elements that connect Arthurian tradition to Anglo-Saxon mythological patterns, while maintaining the basic framework established by Geoffrey and Wace. The presence of fairy women at Arthur's birth, their prophetic declarations about his future achievements, and their gifts of supernatural abilities create connections to Germanic and Celtic mythological traditions, while establishing Arthur's otherworldly authority from the moment of his birth. These additions reflect Layamon's integration of English folkloric traditions with continental literary sources. The Round Table receives extensive treatment in Layamon's adaptation, with detailed descriptions of its construction and symbolic significance that expand considerably upon Wace's innovations. The table's creation by a skilled craftsman specifically to resolve conflicts among Arthur's knights receives elaborate description that emphasises both its practical function and its symbolic importance as a representation of ideal social order. The specific mention of the table's capacity for 1,600 knights demonstrates the vast scale of Arthur's court, while providing a concrete number that would influence later traditions about the fellowship's size. Layamon's account of the Round Table's magical properties introduces elements that connect Arthurian tradition to broader patterns of medieval supernatural belief. The table's ability to accommodate exactly the right number of knights regardless of their actual numbers, its role in revealing the worthiness or unworthiness of those who attempt to sit at it, and its connection to prophetic revelations about future events establish it as more than functional furniture. These supernatural elements reflect contemporary beliefs about the intersection of divine will with earthly affairs, while providing narrative mechanisms for future plot developments. The military campaigns described in Layamon's Brut receive treatment that combines detailed tactical descriptions with supernatural interventions that emphasise Arthur's otherworldly authority. The specific battle formations, siege techniques, and logistical arrangements described throughout Arthur's conquests demonstrate familiarity with contemporary military practices while incorporating elements that exceed normal human capabilities. The systematic conquest of Ireland, Scotland, and continental territories receives more extensive treatment than in earlier sources, with detailed accounts of individual battles and diplomatic negotiations. Arthur's personal combat prowess receives particular emphasis in Layamon's adaptation, with detailed descriptions of his performance in individual combat that connect to Anglo-Saxon heroic traditions while maintaining the supernatural elements established in earlier sources. His sword Caliburn receives extensive description that emphasises both its physical properties and its supernatural origins, establishing it as a character in its own right rather than merely a weapon. The specific combat techniques described, including Arthur's ability to cleave enemies from head to waist, and his supernatural strength that allows him to wield weapons no ordinary man could lift, reflect both Germanic heroic traditions and contemporary military practices. The expansion of Merlin's role in Layamon's adaptation introduces prophetic elements that connect Arthurian tradition to broader patterns of medieval political prophecy, while providing narrative frameworks for understanding contemporary events. Merlin's prophecies receive more extensive treatment than in earlier sources, with specific predictions about the fate of various kingdoms and the ultimate destiny of Britain that could be interpreted in relation to contemporary political developments. The cryptic language employed in these prophecies allows for multiple interpretations while maintaining their apparent historical authority. The treatment of Arthur's final journey to Avalon in Layamon's Brut introduces innovations that would fundamentally influence subsequent Arthurian tradition, while connecting to broader patterns of medieval, other-world belief. The detailed description of Arthur's departure after the Battle of Camlan, his transportation to Avalon for healing, and the prophecy of his eventual return receive more extensive treatment than in any previous source. The specific mention of Argante, the fairy queen who takes Arthur to Avalon, introduces a supernatural character who would influence later traditions about Arthur's otherworld sojourn. Layamon's description of Avalon itself draws on both Celtic otherworld traditions and contemporary medieval conceptions of paradise, while creating a realm that exists outside normal temporal boundaries. The island's location beyond the Western Sea, its inhabitants' supernatural healing abilities, and its isolation from mortal concerns establish it as a place where Arthur can recover from his wounds, while remaining available for future return when Britain faces its greatest need. This innovation provides a resolution to Arthur's story that maintains his legendary status while explaining his absence from contemporary affairs. The prophetic framework surrounding Arthur's return from Avalon introduces elements that would influence medieval political thought while providing mechanisms for connecting Arthurian tradition to contemporary events. The specific conditions described for Arthur's return, including the restoration of British independence and the defeat of foreign oppression, create interpretive frameworks that could be applied to various historical situations while maintaining the legend's contemporary relevance. The ambiguous timeline for this return allows for indefinite postponement while maintaining hope for future fulfillment. The transformation of Arthur from the Dark Age warlord described in early Welsh sources into the medieval king, depicted in 12th and 13th century adaptations, reflects broader changes in European political culture and aristocratic ideals. The systematic incorporation of contemporary chivalric values, courtly ceremonial practices, and feudal administrative arrangements into Arthurian narrative created a legendary framework that served both as entertainment and as a model for contemporary behaviour. This transformation process demonstrates the dynamic relationship between literary tradition and social change during the medieval period. The evolution of knightly ideals within Arthurian literature reflects the development of chivalric culture throughout Western Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries. The systematic codification of behavioural standards for knights, the emphasis on service to ladies and protection of the innocent, and the integration of Christian moral frameworks with martial prowess created idealised models of aristocratic behaviour that influenced actual court culture. The Round Table Fellowship provided a narrative framework for exploring these ideals while maintaining connection to historical tradition through Arthurian legitimacy. The architectural descriptions that appear throughout these adaptations reflect contemporary developments in castle construction and urban planning, while projecting them onto scales that match Arthur's legendary status. The detailed accounts of Camelot's construction, the descriptions of fortified cities throughout Arthur's empire, and the emphasis on magnificent court buildings demonstrate familiarity with contemporary architectural achievements, while creating settings appropriate for legendary events. These descriptions influenced both literary tradition and actual building projects as noble patrons sought to create courts worthy of Arthurian comparison. The administrative arrangements described for Arthur's empire reflect contemporary understanding of effective government, while incorporating idealised elements that served as models for actual political organisation. The systematic appointment of loyal governors, the establishment of legal codes that applied throughout conquered territories, and the creation of communication networks that maintained central authority over vast distances demonstrates sophisticated political thinking while providing frameworks for understanding contemporary governmental challenges. These elements made Arthurian literature relevant to audiences concerned with practical political problems while maintaining its entertainment value. The transformation of Arthurian material from chronicle history into sophisticated literary romance reached its definitive form through the revolutionary works of Chretien de Troyes, whose 5 Arthurian romances composed between the 1160s and 1180s established the narrative frameworks, character archetypes, and thematic concerns that would dominate European literature for centuries. Working under the patronage of Marie de Champagne and Philippe d'Alsace, Count of Flanders, Chretien created a literary form that synthesized the historical authority of Geoffrey's chronicle tradition with the courtly sophistication demanded by aristocratic audiences, producing works that functioned simultaneously as entertainment, moral instruction, and models for contemporary chivalric behaviour. Chretien's literary innovations emerged from the sophisticated court culture that had developed around major French noble houses during the mid-12th century, particularly the court of Champagne, where Marie, daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, had established one of Europe's most influential centres of vernacular literary production. The specific social conditions that fostered Romance literature included the increasing wealth and leisure of the aristocratic class, the development of French as a literary language capable of sophisticated narrative expression, and the emergence of courtly love as a cultural framework that provided new models for aristocratic behaviour and social interaction. The manuscript evidence reveals that Chretien's romances achieved immediate popularity among aristocratic audiences, while establishing literary standards that influenced subsequent romance composition throughout Europe. The surviving manuscripts, many produced in luxury scriptoria with elaborate illuminated initials and decorative borders, indicate patronage by wealthy noble families who valued Arthurian material sufficiently to commission expensive decorated copies. The rapid circulation of these works through established networks of aristocratic courts demonstrates their perceived cultural value while facilitating the spread of Chretien's innovations across linguistic and political boundaries. Eric et Enide, Chretien's earliest surviving Arthurian romance composed around 1170, establishes the fundamental narrative pattern that would characterise the genre throughout the medieval period. The work opens at Arthur's court during the Whitsun celebration, immediately positioning the narrative within the ceremonial framework that had become associated with Arthurian tradition, while introducing the specific courtly practices that distinguish Chretien's version from earlier chronicle accounts. The hunt for the white stag, a traditional royal prerogative that opens the romance, serves both as entertainment and as a mechanism for introducing conflict that will drive the subsequent narrative development. The character of Eric himself represents Chretien's systematic development of the individual knight as a literary protagonist distinct from the collective heroism characteristic of earlier Arthurian material. Unlike the warriors described in Welsh sources who function primarily as members of Arthur's warband, Eric possesses individual motivations, personal relationships, and internal conflicts that drive narrative development independently of larger political concerns. His initial appearance at Arthur's court, seeking to avenge an insult delivered to Queen Guinevere, establishes personal honour as a motivation that can supersede collective loyalty while maintaining connection to Arthurian institutional frameworks. The tournament at Tenebrock, where Eric defeats Ida and wins both victory and marriage to Enida, demonstrates Chretien's sophisticated understanding of contemporary aristocratic culture, while incorporating elements that elevate the events beyond ordinary social occasions. The detailed descriptions of armour, weapons, and fighting techniques reflect accurate knowledge of 12th century military equipment and combat methods. But the supernatural strength demonstrated by the protagonists and the cosmic significance attributed to their victories transform realistic tournaments into legendary events that serve narrative rather than purely mimetic functions. Eric's marriage to Enide introduces the theme of love as both motivation and obstacle that would become central to Romance literature throughout the medieval period. The relationship between martial prowess and romantic devotion, explored through Eric's temporary withdrawal from knightly activities following his marriage, addresses contemporary concerns about the proper balance between public duty and private affection within aristocratic society. The criticism directed at Eric by his fellow knights for neglecting his chivalric obligations in favour of domestic pleasures reflects actual tensions within 12th century noble culture, where military service competed with courtly refinement for aristocratic attention. The series of adventures that occupies the central portion of Eric et Enide establishes the episodic structure that would characterise Romance literature, while providing opportunities for the systematic exploration of chivalric values through individual encounters. Each adventure presents specific moral challenges that test different aspects of knightly behaviour, from courage and martial skill to courtesy and justice, creating a comprehensive examination of aristocratic ideals through narrative demonstration rather than abstract instruction. The progressive increase in difficulty and significance of these challenges reflects the educational function of Romance literature as a means of transmitting cultural values through entertaining narratives. The Joy of the Court episode, which concludes Eric's adventures, introduces supernatural elements that connect Chretien's romance to broader patterns of Celtic otherworld tradition, while adapting them to serve contemporary literary purposes. The Enchanted Garden, where Mabon Grain holds court, surrounded by the heads of defeated knights mounted on stakes, creates an otherworld realm that exists within the mortal world, but operates according to different temporal and moral principles. The specific details of the garden's construction, including its invisible walls and the supernatural preservation of its inhabitants, demonstrate Chretien's ability to integrate fantastical elements with realistic social observation. Culhwch, composed around 1176, represents Chretien's most ambitious attempt to create an Arthurian romance that could compete with classical literary models while maintaining the contemporary relevance that distinguished vernacular literature from Latin scholarly works. The work's complex structure, which divides the narrative between two generations of protagonists connected through family relationships and parallel adventures, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of narrative construction, while providing opportunities for exploring different aspects of chivalric culture through contrasting character types and situations. The Byzantine setting of the romance's opening section reflects the international scope of 12th century aristocratic culture, while providing exotic backgrounds that enhance the work's entertainment value. The detailed descriptions of Constantinople, including its architectural marvels, ceremonial practices and political arrangements, demonstrate Chretien's familiarity with contemporary accounts of the Eastern Empire, while creating settings that match the legendary status of his protagonists. The specific emphasis on the cultural sophistication of Byzantine court life provides standards of comparison that elevate Western European chivalric culture through competitive demonstration of superior values and practices. Alexander's adventures in Arthur's court establish patterns of interaction between foreign knights and established Arthurian fellowship that would influence subsequent romance literature throughout Europe. The systematic testing of newcomers through tournament combat, their gradual integration into court society through demonstrated prowess and courtesy, and their eventual acceptance as full members of the Round Table Fellowship, create narrative frameworks for incorporating diverse characters into Arthurian tradition, while maintaining thematic coherence through shared chivalric values. The love story between Culhwch and Fenice introduces innovations in the literary treatment of adulterous relationships that would influence romance literature throughout the medieval period. The elaborate deceptions employed to prevent the consummation of Fenice's marriage to the Emperor Alice, including the use of magical potions and feigned death, demonstrate Chretien's ability to adapt classical literary motifs to contemporary moral frameworks while maintaining audience sympathy for characters whose actions violate social norms. The specific comparison drawn between Fenice and Tristan's Isolde, with Fenice's explicit rejection of Isolde's willingness to belong to two men, reveals Chretien's conscious engagement with existing literary traditions and his efforts to create alternative models for romantic behaviour. Le Chevalier de la Charrette, composed around 1177 to 1181 at the specific request of Marie de Champagne, represents the most radical development in Chretien's treatment of courtly love while introducing the character who would become the most famous knight of Arthurian tradition. The romance's central premise, that perfect love requires absolute submission of the lover to his lady's will regardless of social consequences or personal honour, pushes the logic of courtly love to extremes that test the compatibility between romantic devotion and chivalric duty. Lancelot's initial appearance in the romance, riding in a cart of shame after losing his horse while pursuing Queen Guinevere's abductors, immediately establishes the tension between knightly honour and romantic devotion that drives the entire narrative. The cart itself, traditionally used for transporting criminals and social outcasts, represents the ultimate humiliation for a knight whose reputation depends on maintaining dignity and honour in all public appearances. Lancelot's momentary hesitation before entering the cart, lasting only 2 steps but sufficient to cause Guinevere's later displeasure, demonstrates the psychological complexity that distinguishes Chretien's characterization from earlier literary models. The systematic degradation of conventional chivalric values throughout Lancelot's quest reveals Chretien's sophisticated understanding of the potential conflicts between different aristocratic ideals. Traditional knightly virtues such as courage, honour, and loyalty to one's lord become obstacles to perfect love when they conflict with the beloved's desires, creating moral dilemmas that have no clear resolution within existing ethical frameworks. The specific episodes where Lancelot must choose between maintaining his reputation and serving Guinevere's interests demonstrate the revolutionary implications of courtly love ideology when carried to logical extremes. The tournament at Noauz, where Lancelot fights alternately as the worst and best knight at Guinevere's command, represents the complete subordination of individual will to romantic devotion while providing spectacular demonstration of the protagonist's exceptional abilities. The crowd's bewilderment at Lancelot's apparently inconsistent performance, combined with their eventual recognition of his true identity and supreme skill, creates dramatic irony that enhances audience engagement, while illustrating the gap between public appearance and private motivation that characterizes courtly love relationships. The Swordbridge episode, where Lancelot crosses a river on a blade that cuts his hands and feet, introduces supernatural elements that transform realistic geography into symbolic landscape representing the spiritual journey required for perfect love. The bridge itself, described as sharp as a sword and spanning an apparently uncrossable chasm, creates a physical challenge that tests not only courage and determination, but also the willingness to suffer for love that distinguishes true devotion from mere attraction. The specific details of Lancelot's crossing, including his removal of armour from hands and feet to ensure better grip despite increased vulnerability to injury, demonstrate the calculated nature of his sacrifice. The liberation of the prisoners in the land of Gore provides the romance with a quest objective that serves broader social purposes while maintaining focus on Lancelot's personal relationship with Guinevere. The systematic rescue of Arthur's subjects who have been trapped in the otherworld realm creates opportunities for displays of martial prowess and chivalric virtue that balance the romance's emphasis on courtly love with more traditional heroic activities. The specific social arrangements in Gore, where captives and natives live according to different rules and customs, reflect contemporary concerns about legal jurisdiction and social hierarchy while providing exotic settings for romantic adventures. Le Chevalier au Lion, composed around 1177 to 1181, represents Chretien's most successful integration of individual psychological development with traditional adventure narrative, creating a romance that explores the relationship between personal identity and social responsibility through a protagonist whose internal conflicts drive external action. The work's sophisticated treatment of marriage, friendship, and knightly obligation provides a comprehensive examination of aristocratic social relationships while maintaining the entertainment value that made romance literature popular among courtly audiences. Yvain's initial adventure at the Magic Fountain establishes supernatural elements that serve both narrative and symbolic functions, while demonstrating Chretien's ability to adapt Celtic otherworld traditions to contemporary literary purposes. The fountain itself, which summons devastating storms when water is poured on its accompanying stone, represents a test that reveals character while providing mechanisms for plot development. The specific details of the fountain's operation, including the golden basin and the elaborate stone decorated with precious gems, create an otherworld realm that exists within the natural world but operates according to different principles than ordinary geography. The defeat and subsequent marriage to Lodine, widow of the knight Yvain as killed, introduces complex moral questions about the relationship between conquest and love that reflect contemporary concerns about the ethics of warfare and marriage politics. Lordine's acceptance of her husband's killer as a replacement spouse, motivated by the practical need for a defender of her lands, demonstrates the subordination of personal emotion to political necessity that characterised aristocratic marriage arrangements. The role of Lunete as intermediary who facilitates this unlikely union reveals the importance of female networks in negotiating relationships between hostile parties within aristocratic society. The friendship between Yvain and Gawain provides opportunities for exploring the tension between individual desires and social obligations that would become central to later Arthurian literature. Gawain's advice that Yvain should avoid the effeminacy that results from excessive devotion to married life reflects contemporary concerns about the proper balance between domestic affection and public duty within aristocratic culture. The specific terms of the agreement that allows Yvain a year's absence from marriage to pursue knightly adventures, with automatic dissolution of the relationship if he fails to return on schedule, creates narrative tension while addressing practical questions about the compatibility of romantic love with chivalric obligations. Yvain's madness following his failure to return to Lordine within the specified time introduces psychological elements that distinguish Chretien's characterization from earlier literary models. The systematic description of the protagonist's mental breakdown, including his loss of memory, abandonment of civilized behavior, and retreat into wilderness living, reflects contemporary understanding of the relationship between emotional trauma and psychological dysfunction. The specific details of his recovery, facilitated by a magic ointment provided by the Lady of Noroson, demonstrate the integration of supernatural healing with realistic observation of mental illness and recovery processes. The series of adventures that occupies the central portion of Yvain provides systematic exploration of different aspects of chivalric obligation, while maintaining narrative coherence through the protagonist's consistent character development. Each encounter presents specific moral challenges that test Yvain's growing understanding of the proper relationship between individual desire and social responsibility, creating educational content that serves aristocratic audiences while maintaining entertainment value through exciting action and exotic settings. The lion that becomes Yvain's companion and identifying characteristic represents both supernatural aid and symbolic representation of the protagonist's character development throughout the romance. The initial rescue of the lion from a serpent establishes Yvain's instinctive commitment to justice and protection of the innocent, while the animal's subsequent loyalty and assistance in combat demonstrate the rewards that follow from virtuous action. The specific fighting techniques employed by the lion, including its ability to attack enemies from behind while Yvain engages them frontally, create tactical advantages that reflect the benefits of loyal friendship while maintaining realistic combat scenarios. Perceval ou le Conte du Grail, Chretien's final and unfinished romance composed around 1181 to 1191, represents his most ambitious literary achievement, while introducing elements that would fundamentally transform Arthurian tradition throughout subsequent centuries. The work's innovative structure, which alternates between the adventures of Perceval and Gawain, while maintaining thematic coherence through parallel character development, demonstrates sophisticated narrative technique while providing opportunities for comprehensive exploration of chivalric ideals through contrasting personality types and moral challenges. The Grail itself, introduced during Perceval's visit to the Fisher King's castle, represents Chretien's most significant contribution to Arthurian legend, while creating interpretive challenges that have engaged scholars and readers for over 8 centuries. The mysterious vessel, carried in solemn procession alongside a bleeding lance and silver carving dish, receives detailed physical description that emphasizes its precious materials and elaborate decoration, while maintaining deliberate ambiguity about its specific function and significance. The gold construction enriched with precious stones, the supernatural light that emanates from the Grail's presence, and the reverent behaviour of all who encounter it establish the object's sacred nature while avoiding explicit, religious identification that would limit interpretive possibilities. The Fisher King's wound, which causes both his personal suffering and the wasteland condition of his realm, introduces the theme of the relationship between royal health and territorial fertility that connects Arthurian tradition to ancient Indo-European kingship concepts, while addressing contemporary concerns about the responsibilities of rulership. The specific nature of the wound, inflicted through the thighs in a manner that suggests but does not explicitly state sexual dysfunction, creates symbolic connections between personal failure and political disaster, while maintaining the discretion required for aristocratic audiences. The king's dependence on fishing as his only possible activity, which gives him his title and determines his court's location beside water, provides concrete details that ground supernatural elements in realistic observation. Perceval's failure to ask the crucial question about the Grail's significance during his first visit to the Fisher King's castle establishes the quest narrative structure that would dominate subsequent Arthurian literature, while providing mechanisms for exploring the relationship between knowledge and action in chivalric culture. The specific prohibition against questioning that governs Perceval's behaviour, learned from his knightly mentor Layamon de Gore, creates dramatic irony where adherence to one set of social rules prevents fulfilment of higher moral obligations. The revelation that asking the appropriate question would have healed the Fisher King and restored fertility to his lands demonstrates the potential consequences of social conformity when it conflicts with compassionate action. The Grail procession itself receives elaborate description that establishes its ceremonial significance, while maintaining interpretive ambiguity about its specific religious or magical functions. The systematic ordering of the procession, beginning with a youth carrying the bleeding lance, followed by two young men bearing golden candelabra, then a beautiful maiden carrying the Grail itself, and finally another maiden with the silver carving platter, creates ritualistic solemnity that suggests sacred ceremony while avoiding explicit religious identification. The specific details of each object's appearance, including the lance's bleeding point and the Grail's brilliant illumination, establish supernatural elements that transcend ordinary material reality, while remaining grounded in recognizable ceremonial practices. The educational function of Perceval's adventures reflects Chretien's systematic exploration of the process, by which naive individuals develop into accomplished knights through experience, instruction, and moral growth. The protagonist's initial ignorance of basic social conventions, demonstrated through his inappropriate behaviour at Arthur's court and his literal interpretation of his mother's advice, provides opportunities for comic relief while establishing baseline conditions for measuring subsequent development. The specific episodes where Perceval gradually learns proper knightly behaviour, from his first clumsy attempts at combat to his eventual mastery of courtly courtesy, create educational content that serves aristocratic audiences while maintaining narrative entertainment through character development. The parallel adventures of Yvain in the latter portion of Perceval provide contrasting approaches to chivalric excellence, while maintaining thematic coherence through shared concerns with honour, love, and social responsibility. Yvain's established reputation as Arthur's premier knight, combined with his sophisticated understanding of courtly behaviour and social expectations, creates dramatic contrast with Perceval's naive enthusiasm and moral absolutism. The specific adventures that test different aspects of Yvain's character, from his defence of maidens under supernatural threat to his navigation of complex romantic entanglements, demonstrate the challenges that face even accomplished knights in maintaining their reputations while serving others. The Castle of Marvels episode, where Gawain must overcome magical defences to rescue imprisoned ladies, introduces supernatural elements that test conventional chivalric virtues while providing spectacular entertainment through exotic settings and mysterious challenges. The Perilous Bed, which attacks anyone who attempts to rest upon it with arrows, crossbow bolts, and a supernatural lion, creates physical dangers that require both courage and tactical intelligence to overcome. The specific mechanisms of the magical defences, including their apparent ability to distinguish between worthy and unworthy visitors, establish supernatural justice systems that reward virtue while punishing vice through automatic consequences. The relationship between individual knight adventures and the broader Arthurian court structure receives systematic development throughout Chretien's romances, creating narrative frameworks that balance personal achievement with collective identity. The regular return of successful knights to Arthur's court for recognition and celebration of their accomplishments establishes cyclical patterns that maintain connection between individual stories and institutional continuity. The specific ceremonies employed to welcome returning heroes, including public recitation of their achievements and formal integration into the Round Table Fellowship, demonstrate the social functions of adventure narrative while providing closure for episodic adventures. The development of courtly love as both literary theme and social ideal receives comprehensive treatment across Chretien's 5 romances, creating systematic exploration of the relationship between romantic devotion and chivalric obligation that would influence European culture for centuries. The progressive sophistication of love relationships, from the relatively straightforward marriage of Eric and Enid through the complex adulterous passion of Lancelot and Guinevere, demonstrates evolving understanding of emotional psychology while addressing practical concerns about the integration of personal desire with social responsibility. The influence of contemporary court culture on Chretien's literary innovations becomes evident through analysis of the specific social practices, ceremonial arrangements, and behavioural standards depicted throughout his romances. The detailed descriptions of tournaments, feasts, and courtly entertainment reflect accurate observation of 12th century aristocratic life, while projecting these realistic elements onto legendary scales that match Arthurian reputation. The systematic codification of chivalric behaviour through narrative demonstration, rather than abstract instruction, creates educational content that serves practical social functions while maintaining entertainment value through exciting adventures and romantic relationships. The manuscript tradition of Chretien's romances reveals their immediate popularity and continued influence throughout the medieval period, with surviving copies indicating widespread circulation among aristocratic audiences across linguistic and political boundaries. The rapid translation of his works into multiple vernacular languages, including German, Italian, and Middle English adaptations, demonstrates their perceived cultural value while facilitating their influence on developing national literary traditions throughout Europe. The systematic adaptation and continuation of unfinished works like Perceval by later authors indicates active engagement with Chretien's innovations rather than passive reception of completed artistic products. The integration of supernatural elements with realistic social observation throughout Chretien's romances creates literary frameworks that serve both entertainment and instructional functions while maintaining the historical authority associated with Arthurian tradition. The systematic incorporation of otherworld realms, magical objects, and supernatural encounters into narratives grounded in recognisable social relationships and political arrangements creates hybrid literary forms that appeal to diverse audience interests while maintaining thematic coherence through consistent character development and moral frameworks. The systematic Christianization of Arthurian legend reached its most profound expression through the development of Grail narratives that transformed Chretien's mysterious vessel into the central symbol of medieval spiritual quest literature. Robert de Boron's revolutionary trilogy, composed around 1200, fundamentally altered the nature of Arthurian romance by providing explicit Christian origins for the Grail, while connecting it directly to the most sacred events of Christian history. Working within the literary frameworks established by Chretien de Troyes, Robert created a comprehensive mythological system that traced the Grail's journey from Christ's Last Supper through Joseph of Arimathea's mission to Britain, establishing religious foundations that would dominate Arthurian literature throughout the remainder of the medieval period. Robert's Joseph d'Arimathea opens the trilogy by identifying the Grail as the cup used by Christ during the Last Supper, later employed by Joseph of Arimathea to collect blood from the crucified Saviour's wounds. This explicit identification transforms Chrétien's ambiguous vessel into Christianity's most precious relic while providing historical continuity that connects Arthurian Britain to the foundational events of Christian salvation. The supernatural properties attributed to the Grail in Robert's account reflect contemporary understanding of relic veneration, while incorporating elements that elevate the vessel beyond ordinary sacred objects. The cup's ability to sustain Joseph during his lengthy imprisonment without food or water demonstrates divine power operating through physical objects, a concept fundamental to medieval Christian spirituality. The specific description of Christ's appearance to Joseph in his prison cell, explaining the cup's significance and instructing him in its proper use, establishes direct divine authorization for the Grail's sacred function while providing theological justification for its central role in Christian salvation history. The establishment of the Grail table, where Joseph and his followers celebrate a communion service that recreates the Last Supper, introduces the concept of spiritual fellowship that would become central to later Arthurian literature. The table's circular form, accommodating Joseph's company of faithful followers while leaving one seat perpetually empty in memory of Judas Iscariot, creates direct parallels to Arthur's Round Table while providing religious significance that transcends secular chivalric ideals. The specific prohibition against unworthy individuals approaching the table, enforced through supernatural intervention that removes or destroys those who attempt to claim the reserved seat, establishes patterns of spiritual testing that would influence all subsequent Grail literature. Robert's Merlin continues the trilogy by connecting the Arthurian court to the Grail tradition through the prophet's knowledge of sacred history and his role in establishing the Round Table as the third in a series of sacred tables. The systematic progression from the table of the Last Supper through Joseph's Grail table to Arthur's Round Table creates a historical continuity that legitimizes secular chivalric institutions through religious precedent, while providing theological frameworks for understanding knightly adventure as spiritual quest. Merlin's prophetic knowledge, derived from his supernatural origins and divine inspiration, enables him to understand the cosmic significance of earthly events while guiding their development toward predetermined spiritual purposes. The construction of the Round Table under Merlin's direction receives detailed description that emphasizes both its practical function as a piece of furniture and its symbolic significance as a representation of divine order. The table's capacity for exactly 50 knights, with places specifically designated for Arthur and his most worthy companions, creates hierarchical arrangements that reflect celestial organization while maintaining the egalitarian principles associated with circular seating. The Siege Perilous, the dangerous seat reserved for the knight destined to achieve the Grail quest, introduces elements of predestination and divine election that transform knightly worthiness from a matter of personal achievement into a question of spiritual calling. The incomplete nature of Robert's trilogy, with the projected Perceval existing only in fragmentary form, creates interpretive challenges while demonstrating the ambitious scope of his literary project. The surviving portions indicate systematic integration of Chrétien's Perceval narrative with the Christian historical framework established in the earlier volumes, suggesting comprehensive reworking of existing Arthurian material to serve explicitly religious purposes. The specific references to Perceval's genealogical connection to Joseph of Arimathea through his grandfather Bron, identified as the Fisher King, create family relationships that link the Grail quest to hereditary spiritual authority, while maintaining narrative connections to established Arthurian characters. The Perlis Vows, composed by an anonymous author around 1200 to 1210, represents the most sophisticated early attempt to create a comprehensive Grail romance that integrates Christian symbolism with traditional Arthurian adventure narrative. The work's complex structure, which presents multiple interconnected quests undertaken by Perceval, Lancelot and Yvain, demonstrates advanced understanding of narrative construction while providing systematic exploration of different approaches to spiritual achievement through chivalric action. The specific emphasis on the relationship between earthly knighthood and heavenly service creates educational content that addresses contemporary concerns about the compatibility of military violence with Christian virtue. The opening of Perceval establishes Arthur's court in a state of spiritual decline that reflects the king's failure to maintain the Christian standards established during his earlier reign. The specific description of Arthur's reluctance to hear Mass, his neglect of charitable obligations, and his court's general abandonment of religious observance creates a wasteland condition that extends beyond the Fisher King's realm to encompass the entire Arthurian kingdom. This innovative approach transforms the traditional wasteland motif from a localized supernatural curse into a comprehensive spiritual crisis that requires systematic redemption through renewed Christian commitment. Perceval's quest in Perceval receives treatment that emphasizes its significance as a model for Christian spiritual development, while maintaining the adventure narrative structure that made Arthurian literature popular among secular audiences. The systematic progression through increasingly difficult challenges, each testing different aspects of Christian virtue, creates educational frameworks that demonstrate the practical application of religious principles through knightly action. The specific encounters with hermits, religious communities, and supernatural manifestations of divine power provide instructional content while maintaining entertainment value through exotic settings and dramatic confrontations. The castle of the Fisher King receives elaborate architectural description that creates symbolic landscapes representing different stages of spiritual development, while maintaining realistic details that ground supernatural elements in recognizable physical environments. The castle's multiple courts, each governed by different ceremonial requirements and populated by figures representing various spiritual conditions, create allegorical geography that guides readers through systematic exploration of Christian doctrine. The specific arrangements of buildings, gardens, and ceremonial spaces reflect contemporary monastery design, while incorporating fantastical elements that elevate the setting beyond ordinary religious architecture. The Grail procession in Perceval expands considerably upon Chrétien's original description, while providing explicit Christian interpretation of each element's symbolic significance. The bleeding lance becomes the spear of Longinus that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion, while additional objects including a sword and various vessels represent different aspects of the Passion narrative. The systematic explanation of each object's historical origins and spiritual meaning transforms the mysterious ceremony into explicit religious instruction, while maintaining the solemn dignity that characterizes liturgical celebration. The role of women in Perceval reflects contemporary religious attitudes toward female spirituality, while adapting traditional Arthurian character types to serve explicitly Christian purposes. The various ladies who assist or challenge the questing knights represent different aspects of spiritual guidance, from the Virgin Mary herself appearing in supernatural manifestations to provide direct divine intervention, to earthly women whose virtue or vice tests the knight's spiritual development. The specific emphasis on chastity as a prerequisite for Grail achievement creates moral frameworks that distinguish spiritual knighthood from secular chivalric culture while maintaining romantic elements that appeal to courtly audiences. The Cistercian influence on Grail literature becomes particularly evident in the systematic development of Galahad as the perfect Grail knight, whose spiritual purity enables him to achieve what earlier heroes could only approach. The Questel Saint Grail, composed around 1225 by a Cistercian monk, presents Galahad as Lancelot's son, whose virgin birth through supernatural intervention creates parallels to Christ's incarnation while providing genetic connection to established Arthurian lineages. The The specific emphasis on Galahad's freedom from original sin, his immunity to temptation, and his predestined role as the Grail achiever reflects Cistercian theological concerns while creating character types that transcend ordinary human limitations. Galahad's arrival at Arthur's court during Pentecost establishes supernatural timing that connects his appearance to the descent of the Holy Spirit, while providing ceremonial frameworks that emphasize his spiritual significance. The specific details of his approach, including his ability to sit safely in the Siege Perilous and his extraction of the sword from the stone floating beside Camelot, demonstrate divine election through miraculous signs while maintaining connection to Arthurian institutional structures. The inscription on the stone identifying the sword as belonging to the knight who will achieve the Grail quest provides prophetic validation while creating dramatic tension through delayed revelation of Galahad's identity. The transformation of the Round Table Fellowship through Galahad's presence reflects Cistercian understanding of the relationship between individual spiritual achievement and collective religious community. The systematic testing of all knights through supernatural challenges that reveal their spiritual condition creates hierarchical arrangements based on religious merit rather than secular accomplishment. The specific adventures assigned to different knights, from Lancelot's humbling encounters that demonstrate the limitations of earthly chivalry, to Perceval's continued spiritual development under Galahad's guidance, provide comprehensive exploration of different stages in Christian spiritual progress. The Grail Castle in the quest receives treatment that emphasizes its function as a representation of the heavenly Jerusalem, while maintaining architectural details that connect it to contemporary religious buildings. The castle's location beyond ordinary geographical boundaries, accessible only to knights who have achieved appropriate spiritual development, creates otherworld realms that exist parallel to earthly reality while remaining connected through divine providence. The specific ceremonial arrangements within the castle, including the celebration of Mass using the Grail as chalice, provide explicit religious interpretation while maintaining the mysterious dignity associated with sacred liturgy. The achievement of the Grail quest through Galahad's spiritual perfection creates resolution that emphasizes the transcendence of earthly concerns, while providing closure for narrative elements established throughout earlier Arthurian literature. The specific description of Galahad's mystic vision, where he perceives divine mysteries that cannot be communicated to earthly audiences, reflects contemporary mystical theology while providing climactic moments that justify the extensive preparation required for Grail achievement. The subsequent assumption of Galahad's soul directly into heaven, bypassing ordinary death and judgment, creates parallels to Christ's ascension while demonstrating the ultimate goal of Christian spiritual development. The systematic failure of other knights to achieve the Grail quest provides instructional content that demonstrates the insufficient nature of secular chivalric virtue when measured against spiritual standards. Lancelot's exclusion from complete Grail achievement due to his adulterous relationship with Guinevere creates moral frameworks that subordinate romantic love to religious obligation, while maintaining sympathy for characters whose human limitations prevent spiritual perfection. The specific encounters where Lancelot experiences partial visions of Grail mysteries before being excluded from complete participation provide dramatic tension while illustrating the relationship between moral purity and spiritual insight. Perceval's role as Galahad's companion and eventual successor as Grail Guardian provides continuity between the older Arthurian tradition and the new Christian interpretation, while demonstrating the possibility of spiritual development through sustained effort and divine grace. His gradual purification through ascetic practices, religious instruction, and supernatural guidance creates educational models for audiences seeking to understand the practical requirements of Christian perfection. The specific details of his hermit life following Galahad's assumption, including his celebration of daily mass and his eventual peaceful death after serving as Grail Keeper, provide realistic frameworks for religious vocation while maintaining connection to adventure narrative traditions. The monastic authorship of major Grail texts reflects the systematic appropriation of secular literary forms to serve religious educational purposes while maintaining entertainment value that ensured popular circulation. The sophisticated theological content embedded within adventure narratives demonstrates clerical familiarity with both scholarly religious discourse and vernacular literary techniques, creating hybrid works that served multiple audiences simultaneously. The specific integration of contemporary theological debates concerning grace, predestination, and the relationship between contemplative and active religious life provides intellectual content while maintaining narrative accessibility through character development and dramatic action. The relationship between earthly and heavenly chivalry receives systematic development throughout Grail literature, as monastic authors sought to provide religious alternatives to secular knightly ideals without entirely rejecting the cultural frameworks that made chivalric literature appealing. The concept of spiritual knighthood, where knights serve Christ as their ultimate lord while maintaining traditional obligations to earthly masters, creates synthesis between religious and secular value systems. The specific behavioural requirements for spiritual knights, including chastity, humility, and complete subordination of personal will to divine purpose, provide moral instruction while maintaining the adventure narrative structures that characterised popular romance literature. The geographical expansion of Grail narratives beyond traditional Arthurian territories reflects the international scope of monastic literary networks, while providing exotic settings that enhance entertainment value through unfamiliar locations and customs. The systematic incorporation of contemporary crusading ideology, where knights undertake spiritual quests that involve military action against infidel enemies, creates synthesis between religious pilgrimage and secular warfare. The specific descriptions of Saracen territories, their political arrangements, and their religious practices demonstrate clerical familiarity with contemporary accounts of the Holy Land while providing opportunities for dramatic confrontations between Christian and pagan worldviews. The development of allegorical interpretation techniques within Grail literature reflects the influence of contemporary biblical exegesis while adapting scholarly hermeneutical methods to serve vernacular literary purposes. The systematic explanation of symbolic meanings embedded within narrative events, character relationships, and physical objects provides instructional content that transforms entertainment into religious education. The specific techniques employed, including typological connections between Old Testament prefigurations and Arthurian fulfillments, demonstrate sophisticated theological training while maintaining accessibility through concrete narrative demonstration, rather than abstract doctrinal exposition. The manuscript tradition of Grail literature reveals the active engagement of monastic scriptoria in producing luxury copies for aristocratic patrons while maintaining institutional copies for internal religious use. The survival of both elaborately illuminated presentation manuscripts and simpler working copies indicates diverse audience expectations, while demonstrating the perceived value of Grail narratives across different social contexts. The specific iconographic programs developed for Grail manuscript illumination, including representations of the Last Supper, the Crucifixion, and various scenes from the quest narratives, create visual interpretive frameworks that guide reader understanding while providing artistic elaboration that enhances the manuscript's cultural prestige. The influence of contemporary liturgical practice on Grail narrative development becomes evident through analysis of ceremonial descriptions, seasonal timing, and sacramental symbolism that pervades the literature. The systematic incorporation of mass ceremonial, including specific references to consecration prayers, communion practices, and feast day observances, creates religious authenticity while providing familiar frameworks that help audiences understand the spiritual significance of narrative events. The particular emphasis on Eucharistic symbolism, where the Grail serves simultaneously as the cup of the Last Supper and the chalice of contemporary mass celebration, creates theological connections between historical events and present religious experience. The transformation of Arthurian legend reached its most comprehensive and influential form through the creation of the Lancelot Grail Cycle, also known as the Vulgate Cycle, composed between approximately 1210 and 1230 by anonymous authors working within Cistercian monastic traditions. This massive prose compilation, consisting of 5 interconnected romances totaling over 3,000 pages in modern editions, represents the most systematic attempt to create a unified Arthurian universe that encompasses the entire legendary history from the origins of the Grail through the destruction of the Round Table. The cycle's innovative prose format abandoned the octosyllabic verse employed by earlier Romance authors in favour of a narrative style that could accommodate vast geographical scope, complex character development, and intricate plot structures that spanned multiple generations of protagonists. The revolutionary prose technique employed throughout the Vulgate cycle reflects sophisticated understanding of narrative construction, while serving the educational purposes that motivated monastic authorship. Unlike verse romance, which required adherence to metrical patterns that often forced artificial word choices and syntactic arrangements, prose allowed for natural speech rhythms and precise theological vocabulary that enhanced the cycle's religious instruction. The specific stylistic features developed by the Vulgate authors, including their use of interlaced narrative structure, where multiple storylines proceed simultaneously before converging at crucial moments, created literary techniques that would influence European fiction throughout the medieval period and beyond. The Histoire del Saint Graal, which opens the cycle chronologically though composed after the central Lancelot section, provides comprehensive Christian origins for Arthurian legend, while establishing the theological framework that governs all subsequent events. The work traces the Grail's history from Christ's crucifixion through Joseph of Arimathea's evangelization of Britain, creating religious foundations that transform secular chivalric adventure into spiritual allegory. The detailed account of Joseph's mission, including his establishment of the first Christian community at Glastonbury and his construction of the original Grail castle, provides geographical specificity that connects legendary events to actual English locations while maintaining supernatural elements that distinguish sacred history from ordinary chronicle narrative. The systematic genealogies presented in the Histoire create family relationships that link major Arthurian characters to the Grail's Christian origins while providing hereditary explanations for their spiritual capabilities. The complex kinship networks traced through multiple generations establish Galahad's descent from Joseph of Arimathea through both paternal and maternal lineages, creating genetic predestination for Grail achievement that reflects contemporary theological debates about grace and election. The specific attention paid to female ancestry, including detailed accounts of the holy women who preserved Grail traditions across generations, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of genealogical transmission while providing religious authority for women's roles in spiritual development. The Histoire de Merlin, which continues the chronological sequence, expands considerably upon Robert de Boron's earlier treatment while integrating the prophet's biography with the broader Christian historical framework established in the opening volume. The work's detailed account of Merlin's supernatural conception, his role in Arthur's birth and coronation, and his establishment of the Round Table receives treatment that emphasises divine providence operating through apparently magical interventions. The specific descriptions of Merlin's prophetic abilities, including his knowledge of future events and his understanding of the cosmic significance of earthly actions, create interpretive frameworks that help readers understand the spiritual meanings embedded within secular adventure narratives. Merlin's construction of the Round Table receives elaborate description that emphasises both its practical function as royal furniture and its symbolic significance as the culmination of sacred table traditions begun with the Last Supper. the table's capacity for exactly 150 knights, with specific seats designated for particular individuals based on their spiritual worthiness, creates hierarchical arrangements that reflect divine order while maintaining the egalitarian principles associated with circular geometry. The siege, perilous, reserved for the knight destined to achieve the Grail quest, receives supernatural protection that destroys unworthy claimants while remaining safely accessible to the predestined achiever, demonstrating divine justice operating through physical objects. The massive Lancelot propre, comprising nearly half the entire cycle's length, presents the most detailed character study in medieval literature, while exploring the tragic contradictions between earthly chivalric excellence and spiritual perfection. The work's intricate structure, which follows Lancelot from his infant abduction by the Lady of the Lake through his eventual exclusion from complete Grail achievement, creates psychological complexity that distinguishes this prose treatment from earlier verse romances. The systematic development of Lancelot's internal conflicts, particularly his struggle between devotion to Guinevere and loyalty to Arthur, provides moral instruction while maintaining audience sympathy for a character whose human limitations prevent spiritual transcendence. Lancelot's education in the otherworld realm of the Lady of the Lake receives extensive treatment that establishes supernatural origins for his exceptional abilities while providing allegorical frameworks for understanding the relationship between natural talent and moral development. The lake itself, described as an underwater palace maintained through enchantment that creates the illusion of dry land for its inhabitants, represents an otherworld realm that exists parallel to ordinary reality while remaining connected through the lady's magical interventions. The specific curriculum provided for Lancelot's education, including instruction in combat techniques, courtly behaviour and chivalric obligations, creates comprehensive training programs that reflect contemporary aristocratic education while incorporating supernatural elements that explain his eventual supremacy among earthly knights. The Lady of the Lake's identity as a figure of ambiguous moral status reflects the cycle's sophisticated treatment of supernatural intervention in human affairs. Her genuine care for Lancelot's development and her accurate prophecies about his future achievements demonstrate benevolent intentions, while her role in fostering his adulterous relationship with Guinevere creates moral complications that prevent simple categorization as either beneficial or harmful influence. The specific magical abilities attributed to her, including her power to manipulate time and space within her aquatic realm and her knowledge of future events, establish supernatural authority that transcends ordinary human limitations while remaining subject to divine providence that governs the ultimate direction of historical events. Lancelot's first arrival at Arthur's court receives detailed description that establishes the ceremonial frameworks governing knightly admission to the Round Table Fellowship, while demonstrating the immediate recognition of exceptional ability that characterizes legendary heroes. The specific tests employed to evaluate new knights, including tournament combat against established members and demonstration of courtesy toward ladies and social inferiors, reflect contemporary aristocratic practices while incorporating supernatural elements that reveal character through extraordinary challenges. The unanimous acceptance of Lancelot despite his unknown origins demonstrates the meritocratic principles that theoretically govern Arthurian society, while creating narrative tension through the concealment of his true identity and otherworld education. The development of the love relationship between Lancelot and Guinevere receives treatment that explores the psychological complexity of adulterous passion, while maintaining the religious framework that condemns such relationships as spiritually destructive. The systematic progression from initial attraction through secret meetings to established adultery creates realistic emotional development, while providing moral instruction about the consequences of placing earthly love above spiritual obligation. The specific scenes depicting their clandestine encounters, including their use of intermediaries, coded messages, and carefully planned meetings reflect accurate observation of how such relationships actually functioned within medieval court society, while maintaining the discretion required for aristocratic audiences. The tragic irony of Lancelot's position as Arthur's greatest knight, while simultaneously betraying him through adultery with the Queen, provides the central moral tension that drives the entire cycle toward its inevitable catastrophic conclusion. The detailed exploration of Lancelot's internal conflicts, including his genuine loyalty to Arthur as lord and friend, combined with his inability to abandon his love for Guinevere, creates psychological realism that distinguishes this treatment from simpler moral allegories. The specific episodes where Lancelot's divided loyalties create practical dilemmas, such as his reluctance to fight at full strength against Arthur's enemies while knowing that victory might harm Guinevere's interests, demonstrate the practical consequences of moral compromise while maintaining sympathy for characters trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The numerous adventures undertaken by Lancelot throughout the Lancelot Propera provide systematic exploration of chivalric ideals while demonstrating both the achievements and limitations of earthly knighthood when measured against spiritual standards. Each individual quest presents specific moral challenges that test different aspects of knightly virtue, from courage and martial skill to justice and protection of the innocent, creating comprehensive examination of aristocratic behavioural ideals through narrative demonstration. The progressive increase in supernatural elements throughout these adventures reflects Lancelot's growing proximity to the Grail quest while foreshadowing his eventual exclusion from complete spiritual achievement due to his moral compromises. The relationship between individual adventure and collective identity receives sophisticated treatment throughout the Lancelot Propera, as the work explores how personal actions affect the broader Arthurian community. The systematic return of successful knights to Arthur's court for recognition and celebration creates cyclical patterns that maintain institutional continuity, while providing opportunities for sharing experiences that benefit the entire fellowship. The specific ceremonial arrangements employed during these homecomings, including public recitation of achievements and formal integration of new members into the Round Table hierarchy, demonstrate the social functions of adventure narrative while providing closure for episodic quests. The Caisse del Saint Graal represents the theological climax of the entire cycle, while providing systematic critique of earthly chivalric values through their measurement against absolute spiritual standards. The work's opening, which describes the Grail's supernatural appearance at Arthur's court during Pentecost, establishes divine timing that connects the quest's beginning to the descent of the Holy Spirit, while creating ceremonial frameworks that emphasize the spiritual significance of subsequent events. The specific details of the Grail's manifestation, including its ability to provide each knight with his favourite food while remaining invisible to unworthy observers, demonstrate selective divine revelation, while establishing the supernatural criteria that will govern quest success. Galahad's arrival at Arthur's court represents the culmination of genetic and spiritual preparation that spans multiple generations, while providing the perfect knight whose virgin purity enables him to achieve what earlier heroes could only approach. His ability to sit safely in the Siege Perilous and to extract the sword from the floating stone demonstrates divine election through miraculous signs, while creating dramatic validation of his predestined role. The specific descriptions of Galahad's physical appearance, emphasizing his otherworldly beauty and the supernatural light that seems to emanate from his presence, establish visual markers of spiritual perfection while maintaining human characteristics that prevent complete alienation from earthly concerns. The systematic testing of all Round Table knights through supernatural adventures that reveal their spiritual condition creates comprehensive moral taxonomy, while providing instructional content about the requirements for Christian perfection. The specific challenges assigned to different knights reflect their individual spiritual needs and limitations, from Lancelot's humbling encounters that demonstrate the insufficiency of earthly virtue to Perceval's continued development under divine guidance. The hermits who provide theological interpretation for these adventures serve as authorial voices that explain the spiritual significance of narrative events while maintaining the adventure framework that ensures popular appeal. The transformation of familiar Arthurian geography into spiritual landscape occurs throughout the quest, as earthly locations acquire symbolic significance that reflects the inner condition of questing knights. Castles become representations of spiritual states, forests symbolize the confusion of worldly existence, and rivers represent the barriers between different levels of spiritual understanding. The specific descriptions of the Grail castle, accessible only to knights who have achieved appropriate spiritual development, create otherworld realms that exist parallel to ordinary reality, while remaining connected through divine providence that governs all earthly events. Lancelot's partial achievement of Grail vision provides the most psychologically complex element of the quest while demonstrating the relationship between moral purity and spiritual insight. His exclusion from complete participation due to his adulterous relationship with Guinevere creates dramatic tension while illustrating the absolute nature of spiritual requirements that admit no compromise with worldly concerns. The specific scene where Lancelot perceives Grail mysteries through a doorway he cannot cross provides visual representation of his spiritual limitations, while maintaining his status as the greatest of earthly knights within his proper sphere of activity. The achievement of the Grail quest through Galahad's spiritual perfection creates resolution that emphasizes transcendence of earthly concerns, while providing closure for narrative elements established throughout the entire cycle. The detailed description of the final Grail ceremony, where Galahad celebrates Mass using the sacred vessel, while Perceval and Bors serve as witnesses, provides explicit religious instruction while maintaining the mysterious dignity associated with sacred liturgy. The subsequent assumption of Galahad's soul directly into heaven, bypassing ordinary death, creates parallels to Christ's ascension while demonstrating the ultimate goal of Christian spiritual development. The Mortar II, which concludes the cycle, presents the systematic destruction of Arthurian civilization through internal conflicts that result from the moral compromises established throughout the preceding narratives. The work's opening, which describes the gradual decline of Round Table Fellowship following the Grail quest's completion, establishes causation that connects spiritual failure to political catastrophe, while maintaining the historical framework that governs legendary narrative. The specific details of this decline, including the reduced number of active knights and the loss of supernatural guidance following Galahad's departure, create realistic political consequences, while providing moral instruction about the relationship between individual virtue and collective stability. The exposure of Lancelot and Guinevere's adultery through Agravain and Mordred's machinations provides the immediate catalyst for civil war, while demonstrating how private moral failures inevitably produce public political consequences. The detailed account of the discovery, including the elaborate trap set to catch the lovers, and the violent confrontation that results from their exposure, creates dramatic tension while providing moral instruction about the impossibility of permanently concealing sin. The specific legal procedures employed in Guinevere's trial for treason reflect contemporary judicial practices while incorporating supernatural elements that reveal divine judgment operating through earthly institutions. Arthur's internal conflict between his roles as husband, king, and friend creates the psychological complexity that distinguishes the Mortar II from simpler accounts of political collapse. His genuine love for both Lancelot and Guinevere, combined with his obligation to uphold justice regardless of personal cost, produces tragic dilemmas that have no satisfactory resolution within existing moral frameworks. The specific scenes depicting Arthur's private anguish, including his reluctant condemnation of Guinevere and his continued affection for Lancelot despite their betrayal, create emotional realism while demonstrating the human cost of maintaining political authority under impossible circumstances. The civil war that results from the exposure of the adultery receives detailed military description that reflects contemporary warfare while incorporating supernatural elements that emphasize the cosmic significance of Arthurian civilization's destruction. The systematic division of the Round Table Fellowship into opposing factions creates tragic irony, as knights who had previously cooperated in maintaining justice find themselves forced to fight against former companions. The specific battles described throughout the conflict, including their tactical arrangements and casualty figures, provide realistic military detail while maintaining the legendary scale appropriate for Arthurian narrative. The Siege of Joyous Gard, where Lancelot has taken Guinevere for protection, represents the climactic military confrontation between former friends whose personal relationships have been destroyed by moral and political necessity. The detailed description of the siege operations, including the construction of siege engines and the systematic investment of the castle, reflects contemporary military engineering while providing opportunities for individual combat between knights who must fight despite their mutual respect and affection. The specific duels arranged between champions from opposing sides create dramatic tension while demonstrating the tragic waste of destroying the fellowship that had previously represented the highest achievement of chivalric civilization. The papal intervention that temporarily resolves the immediate conflict through Guinevere's return to Arthur and Lancelot's exile to France provides religious authority that transcends earthly political arrangements while creating only temporary respite from the fundamental contradictions that drive the narrative toward catastrophe. The specific terms of this settlement, including Lancelot's restoration of Guinevere and his acceptance of banishment, reflect medieval diplomatic practices while incorporating religious elements that emphasize the Church's role in mediating secular conflicts. The emotional scenes depicting the final separation of the lovers provide psychological realism while demonstrating the human cost of political necessity. Arthur's continental campaign against Lancelot in France represents the extension of civil war beyond Britain's borders, while providing opportunities for the treachery that will ultimately destroy Arthurian civilization. The detailed military preparations for this expedition, including the assembly of forces and the appointment of Mordred as regent, create realistic political arrangements while establishing the conditions that enable the final catastrophe. The specific battles fought in France between Arthur and Lancelot demonstrate continued mutual respect despite their political opposition, while providing tragic irony as the greatest knights of their generation destroy each other through circumstances beyond their control. Mordred's usurpation of Arthur's throne during the king's absence in France provides the ultimate betrayal that transforms civil war into cosmic disaster, while demonstrating how political weakness enables evil to triumph over established order. The detailed account of Mordred's seizure of power, including his forged claims about Arthur's death and his attempted forced marriage to Guinevere, reflects realistic political opportunism, while incorporating supernatural elements that reveal divine judgment against the moral failures that have weakened Arthurian authority. The specific reactions of various nobles to Mordred's claims create complex political situations that reflect the practical difficulties of maintaining loyalty during periods of uncertain succession. The Battle of Camlan receives treatment that emphasizes its significance as the end of an age, rather than simply another military engagement, with supernatural portents and divine interventions that mark the conclusion of Arthurian civilization. The detailed tactical description of the battle, including the positioning of forces and the progression of combat, provides realistic military detail while incorporating legendary elements that elevate the conflict beyond ordinary warfare. The systematic destruction of the Round Table Fellowship through mutual slaughter creates tragic irony as the institution created to maintain justice destroys itself through the very conflicts it was designed to prevent. Arthur's final duel with Mordred provides personal resolution to the political catastrophe, while demonstrating the ultimate cost of the moral compromises that have undermined Arthurian authority throughout the cycle. The detailed description of their combat including the specific wounds inflicted and the supernatural strength that enables Arthur to continue fighting despite mortal injury, creates dramatic climax while providing symbolic representation of good and evil, destroying each other through their mutual conflict. The specific details of Arthur's final wound, inflicted by Mordred's dying blow, create parallels to the Fisher King's wound, while suggesting that the king's personal failure has produced the wasteland condition that affects his entire realm. The mysterious departure of Arthur to Avalon for healing provides conclusion that maintains the king's legendary status while explaining his absence from subsequent historical events. The detailed description of the boat that arrives to transport the wounded king, crewed by supernatural ladies including Morgan Le Fay, creates other-world elements that connect Arthurian legend to broader Celtic mythological traditions, while providing hope for eventual return when Britain faces its greatest need. The specific ambiguity maintained about Arthur's ultimate fate, whether death or supernatural preservation, allows for multiple interpretations while preserving the legend's contemporary relevance for audiences seeking political hope during periods of crisis. The systematic expansion of Arthurian legend beyond its Anglo-Norman origins occurred through the active translation and adaptation efforts of clerical and secular authors across medieval Europe, each bringing distinctive cultural perspectives and literary traditions that fundamentally transform the legend's character, while maintaining its essential narrative frameworks. The German-speaking territories of the Holy Roman Empire proved particularly receptive to Arthurian material, producing sophisticated literary works that combined French Romance models with indigenous Germanic heroic traditions and contemporary theological concerns. These German adaptations, created primarily during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, demonstrate how Arthurian legend served as a vehicle for exploring universal themes of knightly virtue, spiritual quest, and political authority while adapting to specific cultural contexts that reflected local aristocratic values and religious preoccupations. Wolfram von Eschenbach's Perceval, composed between 1200 and 1210, represents the most significant German contribution to Arthurian literature, while fundamentally reimagining the Grail legend through distinctly Germanic cultural lenses. Working from Chretien de Troyes' unfinished Perceval as his primary source, Wolfram created a comprehensive narrative that expanded the French original's scope, while introducing innovative elements drawn from contemporary crusading ideology, mystical theology, and German courtly culture. The work's complex structure, which interweaves Perceval's spiritual development with Gawain's secular adventures while maintaining thematic coherence through parallel character development, demonstrates sophisticated literary technique while serving the educational purposes valued by aristocratic audiences seeking models for Christian knighthood. Wolfram's treatment of the Grail itself represents perhaps the most radical reinterpretation of this central symbol in medieval literature, transforming Chretien's mysterious vessel into a magical stone called the Lapsit Exilis that possesses supernatural properties derived from its celestial origins, rather than its connection to Christ's passion. The detailed description of this stone's appearance and function establishes it as a cosmic object that fell from heaven during Lucifer's rebellion, creating theological frameworks that connect earthly spiritual quest to the fundamental struggle between good and evil that governs universal history. The stone's ability to provide inexhaustible food and drink to worthy recipients while remaining invisible to the unworthy reflects contemporary beliefs about the relationship between spiritual purity and material blessing, while its role in sustaining the Grail community creates practical mechanisms for understanding how divine providence operates through physical objects. The Grail community itself receives elaborate description that reflects contemporary monastic ideals, while incorporating elements drawn from military religious orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers. The Grail castle of Monsalvische, ruled by the wounded Fisher King Anfortas, operates as a religious community where knights and ladies live, according to strict moral codes that emphasize chastity, humility, and service to divine will. The specific organisational arrangements described for this community, including the selection of new members through divine calling rather than hereditary succession, reflect contemporary debates about religious vocation while providing alternative models for aristocratic life that transcend secular political arrangements. The concept of Grail kingship introduced by Wolfram creates innovative political theology that addresses contemporary concerns about the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The Grail King serves simultaneously as military commander and religious leader, responsible for defending the Grail community against external threats while maintaining the spiritual purity necessary for the stone's continued beneficence. The specific requirements for Grail kingship, including virgin purity until marriage and complete submission to divine will as revealed through angelic messages that appear on the stone's surface, establish behavioural standards that exceed ordinary chivalric virtue while remaining theoretically achievable through sustained spiritual effort. Perceval's genealogical connection to the Grail community, through his father Gamoret's relationship with the Grail King's family, creates hereditary frameworks that combine Germanic concepts of blood nobility with Christian ideas about spiritual election. The detailed genealogies presented throughout the work trace complex kinship networks that link major characters to both earthly royal houses and the supernatural Grail lineage, creating genetic predestination for spiritual achievement that reflects contemporary theological debates about grace and free will. The specific attention paid to maternal ancestry, particularly through Perceval's mother, Lloyd's connection to Grail traditions, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of genealogical transmission, while providing religious authority for women's roles in spiritual development. The educational structure of Perceval's development from naive youth to Grail King provides systematic exploration of the relationship between natural nobility and moral education, while addressing contemporary concerns about the proper training of aristocratic youth. The detailed account of his childhood isolation under his mother's protection, designed to prevent his involvement in knightly activities that had killed his father and brothers, creates psychological realism while establishing the innocent ignorance that enables his eventual spiritual achievement. The specific episodes depicting his gradual acquisition of knightly skills and courtly behaviour demonstrate the importance of proper instruction while maintaining the supernatural elements that distinguish legendary heroes from ordinary aristocrats. Gurneman's role as Perceval's knightly mentor receives extensive treatment that reflects contemporary pedagogical practices while incorporating moral instruction that transcends purely secular concerns. The detailed curriculum provided for Perceval's chivalric education, including combat techniques, courtly behaviour, and the proper treatment of ladies and social inferiors, creates comprehensive training programs that serve aristocratic audiences while emphasising the religious obligations that govern Christian knighthood. The specific advice given by Gurnemanz about avoiding excessive questioning, which ultimately prevents Perceval from asking the crucial question during his first visit to the Grail Castle, creates dramatic irony while demonstrating how adherence to social conventions can conflict with higher moral obligations. The parallel adventures of Gawain throughout the work provide contrasting approaches to knightly excellence, while maintaining thematic coherence through shared concerns with honour, love, and social responsibility. Gawain's established reputation as Arthur's premier knight, combined with his sophisticated understanding of courtly behaviour and political arrangements, creates dramatic contrast with Perceval's naive enthusiasm and spiritual absolutism. The specific adventures that test different aspects of Gawain's character, from his defence of maidens under supernatural threat to his navigation of complex romantic entanglements, demonstrate the achievements and limitations of secular chivalric culture when measured against the absolute spiritual standards represented by the Grail quest. The Castle of Marvels episode, where Gawain must overcome magical defences to rescue imprisoned ladies, introduces supernatural elements that reflect Germanic mythological traditions, while serving the romance's broader themes about the relationship between earthly and spiritual knighthood. The detailed description of the castle's magical defences, including the perilous bed that attacks intruders with arrows and supernatural beasts, creates otherworld challenges that test conventional chivalric virtues while providing spectacular entertainment through exotic settings and mysterious dangers. The specific mechanisms of these magical defences, including their apparent ability to distinguish between worthy and unworthy visitors, establish supernatural justice systems that reward virtue while punishing vice through automatic consequences. Wolfram's treatment of courtly love receives sophisticated analysis that explores the psychological complexity of romantic relationships while maintaining the religious framework that governs the work's moral instruction. The various love relationships depicted throughout the narrative, from Perceval's marriage to Conduiramur's to Gawain's numerous romantic entanglements, provide comprehensive examination of different approaches to the integration of sexual desire with spiritual development. The specific emphasis on marriage as the proper context for physical love, combined with a requirement that Grail knights maintain chastity until divinely approved marriage, creates moral frameworks that address contemporary concerns about the compatibility of romantic passion with religious obligation. The role of women in Wolfram's narrative reflects contemporary attitudes toward female spirituality, while introducing innovative elements that expand traditional gender roles within chivalric literature. The various ladies who assist or challenge the male protagonists represent different aspects of feminine virtue and vice, from Conduiramur's patient loyalty during Perceval's absence, to the temptresses who test Gawain's moral resolve through sexual seduction. The specific emphasis on women's roles as spiritual guides and moral teachers, particularly through figures like the Grail bearer Réponse de Troyes, creates religious authority for feminine wisdom while maintaining the masculine focus that characterises knightly romance literature. The multicultural elements introduced throughout Perceval reflect the international scope of crusading culture, while providing exotic backgrounds that enhance the work's entertainment value through unfamiliar settings and customs. The detailed descriptions of Perceval's half-brother Ferrofir, born of Gameret's marriage to the Moorish queen Belicani, create positive representations of non-Christian nobility that challenge contemporary prejudices while maintaining the religious framework that governs spiritual achievement. The specific details of Saracen court culture, including their military practices, ceremonial arrangements, and philosophical traditions, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of Islamic civilization, while providing opportunities for dramatic confrontations between different worldviews. The theological implications of Ferrofis's eventual conversion and marriage to the Grail bearer establish frameworks for understanding the relationship between natural virtue and Christian revelation that reflect contemporary missionary theology. His initial inability to perceive the Grail due to his pagan status, followed by his immediate conversion upon witnessing its miraculous properties, creates dramatic demonstration of Christianity's universal appeal while maintaining the exclusivity that distinguishes true believers from mere admirers. The specific details of his baptism ceremony and subsequent marriage provide religious instruction, while demonstrating the practical benefits that result from spiritual conversion. The conclusion of Perceval through the protagonist's achievement of Grail kingship provides resolution that emphasises the integration of spiritual perfection with earthly responsibility, while maintaining hope for continued divine guidance in temporal affairs. The detailed description of Perceval's final visit to the Grail castle, where his compassionate question heals and fortis and enables his own assumption of royal authority, creates dramatic climax while providing moral instruction about the importance of charity and Christian spiritual development. The specific arrangements made for the governance of both the Grail community and Perceval's earthly territories demonstrate practical political wisdom while maintaining the religious framework that governs all legitimate authority. The manuscript tradition of Perceval reveals its immediate popularity among German aristocratic audiences while demonstrating the active adaptation of French literary models to serve Germanic cultural needs. The surviving manuscripts, many produced in luxury scriptoria with elaborate illuminated initials and decorative programs that reflect German artistic traditions, indicate patronage by wealthy noble families who valued Arthurian material sufficiently to commission expensive decorated copies. The specific iconographic programs developed for German Arthurian manuscripts, including representations of the Grail stone and various scenes from the quest narratives, create visual interpretive frameworks that guide reader understanding while providing artistic elaboration that enhances the manuscript's cultural prestige. The Italian reception of Arthurian legend occurred within the context of the peninsula's complex political situation, where competing city-states, papal territories and foreign kingdoms created diverse cultural environments that influenced how French Romance models were adapted to serve local needs. The systematic translation and adaptation of French Arthurian texts began during the 13th century, producing vernacular works that combined continental literary sophistication with distinctly Italian concerns about urban politics, commercial culture, and the relationship between secular and religious authority. These Italian adaptations demonstrate how Arthurian legend served as a vehicle for exploring contemporary political issues while providing entertainment that appealed to both aristocratic and merchant audiences seeking cultural sophistication. The development of Tristan and Isolde, narratives within Italian literary tradition, represents one of the most significant regional contributions to Arthurian legend, producing works that expanded the tragic love story's psychological complexity while integrating it more fully into the broader Arthurian universe. The Tristano Ricardiano, composed in Tuscany during the late 13th century, demonstrates sophisticated narrative technique while addressing contemporary concerns about the relationship between passionate love and social obligation. The work's detailed exploration of the lovers' internal conflicts, particularly their struggle between romantic devotion and loyalty to Mark, creates psychological realism that distinguishes Italian treatments from earlier French models while maintaining the tragic inevitability that drives the narrative toward catastrophic conclusion. The systematic integration of Tristan material into the broader Arthurian cycle through his eventual membership in the Round Table Fellowship represents innovative narrative development that addresses the structural problem of connecting the isolated love story to the larger legendary framework. The detailed account of Tristan's adventures as a knight of Arthur's court, undertaken during temporary separations from Isolde, provides opportunities for demonstrating his chivalric excellence, while maintaining the romantic tension that drives the central narrative. The specific episodes depicting his interactions with established Arthurian characters, particularly his friendship with Lancelot based on their shared experience of adulterous love, create thematic coherence while expanding the psychological complexity of both characters. The treatment of courtly culture within Italian Arthurian literature reflects the sophisticated urban civilization that had developed in major Italian cities during the 13th and 14th centuries, adapting French feudal models to serve audiences familiar with republican government and commercial prosperity. The detailed descriptions of court ceremonies, tournaments, and diplomatic negotiations demonstrate familiarity with contemporary Italian political practices while projecting them onto legendary scales that match Arthurian reputation. The specific emphasis on legal procedures, commercial arrangements, and urban architectural settings creates cultural authenticity while maintaining the exotic appeal that made Arthurian literature attractive to audiences seeking escape from ordinary concerns. The influence of Dante's literary innovations on subsequent Italian Arthurian literature becomes evident through the systematic incorporation of allegorical interpretation techniques and sophisticated theological content that transforms adventure narrative into spiritual instruction. The development of complex symbolic frameworks where earthly events represent spiritual realities creates educational content that serves religious purposes while maintaining entertainment value through exciting action and romantic relationships. The specific techniques employed, including typological connections between Arthurian events and biblical narratives, demonstrate scholarly theological training while maintaining accessibility through concrete narrative demonstration rather than abstract doctrinal exposition. The manuscript evidence for Italian Arthurian literature reveals diverse patronage patterns that reflect the peninsula's complex social structure, with luxury copies commissioned by noble families alongside simpler versions produced for merchant audiences seeking cultural sophistication. The survival of both elaborately illuminated presentation manuscripts and working copies indicates varied audience expectations, while demonstrating the perceived value of Arthurian narratives across different social contexts. The specific artistic programs developed for Italian Arthurian manuscripts, incorporating elements from both French illumination traditions and indigenous Italian decorative styles, create hybrid visual cultures that reflect the international nature of medieval literary exchange, while maintaining distinctive regional characteristics. The integration of Arthurian elements into medieval European chronicles and histories demonstrates the legend's perceived historical authority, while revealing how different regions adapted the material to serve local political needs. The systematic incorporation of Arthurian events into national historical narratives, from Scandinavian sagas to Iberian chronicles, creates comprehensive legendary frameworks that connect local political developments to the broader European cultural tradition established through French literary models. These chronicle adaptations demonstrate sophisticated understanding of historiographical techniques while serving contemporary political purposes through their validation of dynastic claims and territorial arrangements. The artistic representation of Arthurian themes throughout medieval European decorative arts reveals the legend's penetration into visual culture while demonstrating how different artistic traditions adapted literary material to serve ceremonial and symbolic purposes. The systematic development of Arthurian iconography, from manuscript illuminations to architectural sculpture and luxury metalwork, creates comprehensive visual programs that guide interpretation while providing artistic elaboration that enhances the legend's cultural prestige. The specific artistic techniques employed, including the adaptation of classical and Byzantine models to serve Arthurian subjects, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of visual narrative while creating distinctive regional styles that reflect local artistic traditions and patron preferences. The culminating achievement of medieval Arthurian literature emerged through the comprehensive synthesis created by Thomas Malory in his Le Morte d'Arthur, completed around 1469 to 1470 during his imprisonment in Newgate Prison. This monumental work represented the first systematic attempt to unify the disparate traditions that had developed across 3 centuries of continental romance writing, chronicle compilation, and vernacular adaptation into a coherent English narrative that would define Arthurian legend for subsequent generations. Malory's editorial vision transformed the complex, often contradictory materials found in his French sources into a unified tragic arc that traced the Round Table's rise, from Arthur's miraculous birth through its inevitable destruction at Camlan, creating literary frameworks that emphasized the transient nature of earthly glory while celebrating the enduring power of chivalric ideals. Malory's source materials reflected the international scope that Arthurian literature had achieved by the 15th century, drawing primarily from the French Vulgate Cycle while incorporating elements from English alliterative poems, chronicle traditions, and popular romance narratives that had circulated throughout medieval Europe. His systematic use of the Lancelot Grail cycle provided the fundamental narrative structure, but his editorial decisions reveal sophisticated literary judgment in selecting, condensing, and reorganising this massive corpus to serve his specific artistic and moral purposes. The evidence suggests he worked from multiple manuscript versions of his French sources, comparing different readings and selecting variants that best supported his vision of Arthurian history as a unified tragic narrative driven by the fundamental contradiction between individual desire and collective responsibility. The French prose romances that formed Malory's primary sources had achieved remarkable narrative sophistication through their interlaced structure, where multiple storylines proceeded simultaneously before converging at crucial moments. However, this technique created interpretive challenges for readers attempting to follow individual character development across hundreds of pages of complex interconnected adventures. Malory's editorial approach simplified this structure by organising the material into 8 distinct books that followed chronological progression while maintaining thematic coherence through consistent character portrayal and moral framework. This reorganisation demonstrated his understanding of English literary preferences while preserving the psychological complexity that distinguished French romance from earlier chronicle traditions. The alliterative Morte Arthur, an English poem composed during the 14th century, provided Malory with alternative treatments of Arthur's continental campaigns and final battles that emphasised military realism over supernatural romance elements. This source's detailed descriptions of siege warfare, tactical formations, and the brutal realities of medieval combat influenced Malory's portrayal of the civil wars that destroy Arthurian civilization, creating narrative authenticity that grounded legendary events in recognisable historical contexts. The specific details of armour, weapons, and fighting techniques drawn from this English tradition provided cultural authenticity that distinguished Malory's work from its French sources while maintaining the legendary scale appropriate for Arthurian narrative. The stanzaic Morte Arthur, another Middle English poem that focused on the tragic conclusion of Arthurian legend, contributed to Malory's understanding of how the adultery between Lancelot and Guinevere inevitably leads to political catastrophe. This source's emphasis on the psychological complexity of the 3 central characters, Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere, provided models for character development that transcended simple moral allegory while maintaining the tragic inevitability that drives the narrative toward its catastrophic conclusion. The specific treatment of Arthur's internal conflict between his roles as husband, king, and friend influenced Malory's portrayal of the monarch as a figure trapped by circumstances beyond his control, rather than a simple victim of others' treachery. Malory's editorial decisions in adapting his sources reveal sophisticated understanding of narrative construction and audience expectations, while serving his broader purpose of creating a unified English Arthurian tradition. His systematic reduction of supernatural elements, particularly the elaborate otherworld adventures and magical interventions that characterise French romance, created more realistic narrative frameworks while maintaining the legendary atmosphere that distinguished Arthurian literature from ordinary historical chronicle. The specific changes he made to Grail narratives, emphasising the quest's spiritual significance while reducing the complex theological allegory found in Cistercian sources, demonstrate his ability to preserve essential religious meaning while making the material accessible to secular audiences. The opening section of Le Morte d'Arthur, which recounts Arthur's conception, birth, and rise to kingship, establishes the fundamental themes that govern the entire work while demonstrating Malory's skill in synthesizing multiple source traditions into coherent narrative. The detailed account of Uther Pendragon's deception of Igraine through Merlin's magic provides supernatural legitimacy for Arthur's conception, while introducing the pattern of moral compromise that will ultimately destroy Arthurian civilization. The specific circumstances of Arthur's fostering by Sir Ector, his ignorant withdrawal of the sword from the stone, and his gradual recognition as rightful king create realistic character development while maintaining the prophetic framework that establishes divine sanction for his authority. Merlin's role throughout the early portions of Malory's narrative receives treatment that emphasizes his function as divine agent while foreshadowing the tragic consequences of the moral compromises he facilitates. The detailed prophecies he provides about future events, from the Round Table's establishment through its eventual destruction, create interpretive frameworks that help readers understand the cosmic significance of apparently secular political events. His systematic arrangement of Arthur's marriage to Guinevere, despite his prophetic knowledge that this union will ultimately destroy the kingdom, introduces the theme of fate versus free will that pervades the entire work while demonstrating how even supernatural wisdom cannot prevent the tragic consequences of human moral failure. The establishment of the Round Table receives elaborate treatment that emphasizes both its practical function as a solution to precedence disputes and its symbolic significance as the culmination of chivalric civilization. Malory's description of the table's construction, incorporating elements from multiple source traditions while adding original details that enhance its legendary status, creates physical authenticity while maintaining symbolic meaning. The specific arrangements for seating, including the designation of particular places for Arthur's greatest knights, and the reservation of the siege perilous for the knight destined to achieve the Grail quest, establish hierarchical frameworks that reflect divine order while maintaining the egalitarian principles associated with circular geometry. The systematic presentation of individual knight adventures throughout the central portions of Le Morte d'Arthur demonstrates Malory's editorial skill in selecting episodes that illustrate different aspects of chivalric virtue while maintaining narrative coherence through consistent character development. Each major knight receives treatment that explores his particular strengths and weaknesses, from Lancelot's supreme martial prowess, compromised by his adulterous love, to Gareth's youthful enthusiasm, tragically cut short by political necessity. The specific adventures assigned to different characters reflect their individual spiritual and moral development, while contributing to the broader narrative arc that traces the Round Table's gradual decline from its initial perfection toward inevitable destruction. Lancelot's central position within Malory's narrative reflects his status as the supreme exemplar of earthly chivalric virtue, while embodying the fundamental contradiction between individual excellence and collective responsibility that drives the work's tragic development. The detailed account of his adventures, from his initial arrival at Arthur's court through his eventual exclusion from complete Grail achievement, creates psychological complexity that distinguishes Malory's characterization from simpler moral allegories. His relationship with Guinevere receives treatment that explores the genuine emotional bonds between the lovers, while never obscuring the destructive consequences their adultery will have for Arthurian civilization. The Grail quest section of Le Morte d'Arthur represents Malory's most significant editorial achievement, condensing the complex theological allegory of his Cistercian sources into accessible narrative while preserving the essential spiritual meaning that distinguishes this quest from ordinary knightly adventures. His systematic reduction of elaborate religious symbolism and doctrinal exposition creates more direct storytelling while maintaining the moral framework that establishes absolute spiritual standards against which earthly chivalric virtue must be measured. The specific treatment of Galahad's achievement, Perceval's spiritual development, and Lancelot's partial success provides comprehensive exploration of different approaches to Christian perfection, while demonstrating the insufficient nature of purely secular virtue. Galahad's portrayal throughout the Grail quest demonstrates Malory's ability to maintain the character's spiritual perfection while making him psychologically credible rather than simply an allegorical representation of religious virtue. The detailed account of his adventures, from his arrival at Arthur's court through his achievement of the Grail vision, creates realistic character development while preserving the supernatural elements that distinguish him from ordinary knights. His relationships with other characters, particularly his respectful interactions with his father Lancelot and his guidance of Perceval's spiritual development, provide human emotional content while maintaining his status as the divinely chosen achiever of ultimate spiritual quest. The systematic failure of most Round Table Knights to achieve the Grail quest provides instructional content about the relationship between worldly success and spiritual achievement, while maintaining sympathy for characters whose human limitations prevent religious perfection. Lancelot's exclusion from complete Grail participation, due to his moral compromises, receives particularly detailed treatment that explores the psychological complexity of his position as the greatest earthly knight whose very excellence in secular terms prevents his spiritual transcendence. The specific scenes depicting his partial visions of Grail mysteries, followed by his recognition of his spiritual limitations, create dramatic tension while providing moral instruction about the absolute nature of Christian requirements. The final sections of Le Morte d'Arthur, which recount the exposure of Lancelot and Guinevere's adultery and the subsequent civil war that destroys Arthurian civilization, represent Malory's most sophisticated narrative achievement, while providing comprehensive exploration of how private moral failures produce public political catastrophe. The detailed account of Agravain and Mordred's plot to expose the lovers demonstrates realistic political manoeuvring, while maintaining the tragic inevitability that has been building throughout the entire narrative. The specific legal procedures employed in Guinevere's trial for treason reflect contemporary judicial practices while incorporating the personal relationships that make the political necessity emotionally devastating for all participants. Arthur's response to the discovery of the adultery reveals Malory's understanding of the psychological complexity that distinguishes tragic literature from simple moral instruction. The king's internal conflict between his love for both Lancelot and Guinevere and his obligation to uphold justice regardless of personal cost creates realistic emotional development while demonstrating the human consequences of maintaining political authority under impossible circumstances. The specific scenes depicting Arthur's private anguish, including his reluctant condemnation of Guinevere and his continued affection for Lancelot despite their betrayal, provide psychological authenticity while maintaining the legendary dignity appropriate for Arthurian narrative. The civil war that results from the adultery's exposure receives detailed military description that reflects Malory's familiarity with contemporary warfare, while maintaining the legendary scale appropriate for Arthurian civilization's destruction. The systematic division of the Round Table Fellowship into opposing factions creates tragic irony as knights who had previously cooperated in maintaining justice find themselves forced to fight against former companions. The specific battles described throughout the conflict demonstrate tactical realism while incorporating the individual combat encounters that allow for personal recognition between enemies who must fight despite their mutual respect and shared history. The Siege of Joyous Gard, where Lancelot has taken Guinevere for protection, provides the climactic military confrontation while exploring the emotional complexity of a conflict where victory for either side represents the destruction of everything the participants had previously valued. The detailed description of siege operations, including the construction of engines and the systematic investment of the castle, reflects contemporary military practice while providing opportunities for the individual encounters between former friends that create the work's most emotionally powerful scenes. The specific arrangements for single combat between champions from opposing sides demonstrate chivalric conventions while emphasizing the tragic waste involved in destroying the fellowship that had represented the highest achievement of knightly civilization. The papal intervention that temporarily resolves the immediate conflict through Guinevere's return to Arthur and Lancelot's exile provides religious authority while creating only brief respite from the fundamental contradictions that drive the narrative toward its inevitable catastrophic conclusion. The emotional scenes depicting the final separation of the lovers provide psychological realism while demonstrating how political necessity destroys personal relationships that had provided meaning and purpose for individual lives. Lancelot's acceptance of exile and Guinevere's return to Arthur create temporary stability while establishing the conditions that enable Mordred's eventual treachery. The Battle of Camlan receives treatment that emphasises its cosmic significance as the end of an age, while maintaining realistic military detail that grounds legendary events in recognisable historical contexts. The detailed tactical description of the battle, including the positioning of forces and the progression of combat, reflects contemporary warfare while incorporating supernatural portents that mark the conclusion of Arthurian civilization. The systematic destruction of the Round Table Fellowship through mutual slaughter creates tragic irony, while demonstrating how the institution created to maintain justice ultimately destroys itself through the very conflicts it was designed to prevent. Arthur's final duel with Mordred provides personal resolution to the political catastrophe, while exploring the ultimate consequences of the moral compromises that have undermined royal authority throughout the narrative. The detailed description of their combat, including the specific wounds inflicted and the supernatural strength that enables Arthur to continue fighting despite mortal injury, creates dramatic climax while providing symbolic representation of legitimate authority, destroying itself through its conflict with usurping treachery. The mutual destruction of both combatants demonstrates how civil war inevitably produces consequences that transcend the immediate political issues that precipitated the conflict. The mysterious departure of Arthur to Avalon maintains the legend's essential ambiguity while providing hope that transcends the immediate catastrophe of Camlan. The detailed description of the boat that arrives to transport the wounded king, crewed by supernatural ladies including Morgan Le Fay, creates otherworld elements while preserving the possibility of their eventual return when Britain faces its greatest need. The specific inscription on Arthur's tomb, stating that he is the once and future king, establishes the legend's enduring political relevance while acknowledging the historical reality of his apparent death. William Caxton's decision to print Le Morte Data in 1485 represented a crucial moment in the legend's transmission, transforming Malory's manuscript compilation into the first widely available English Arthurian text while establishing its authority for subsequent generations of readers. Caxton's editorial interventions, including his division of Malory's work into 21 books and his addition of chapter headings and summaries, created structural frameworks that enhanced the work's accessibility while preserving its essential narrative integrity. The specific timing of this publication, coinciding with Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field and his establishment of the Tudor dynasty, provided contemporary political relevance while ensuring the work's circulation among audiences seeking cultural legitimacy for the new royal house. The printing revolution initiated by Caxton's publication fundamentally altered how Arthurian legend reached its audiences, replacing the manuscript tradition that had governed literary transmission throughout the medieval period with mechanical reproduction that ensured textual stability while enabling mass circulation. The specific editorial decisions made by Caxton and subsequent early printers, including their standardization of spelling, punctuation and chapter divisions, created authoritative versions that influenced all subsequent English Arthurian literature, while establishing Malory's synthesis as the definitive medieval treatment of the legend. Le Morte d'Arthur thus represents the culmination of medieval Arthurian tradition while establishing the foundation for all subsequent English treatments of the legend. Malory's editorial achievement in synthesizing centuries of diverse literary development into a unified tragic narrative created comprehensive frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual moral choice and collective political consequence, while preserving the legendary atmosphere that had made Arthurian literature appealing across cultural and temporal boundaries. His work concluded the formative period of Arthurian legend by providing definitive English treatment that would dominate subsequent literary development, while preserving the essential medieval understanding of chivalric virtue, spiritual quest, and political authority that had motivated 3 centuries of continental romance composition. The completion of Malory's synthesis marked the end of the medieval Arthurian tradition's creative development, as subsequent authors would work primarily within the frameworks he established, rather than creating fundamentally new approaches to the legendary material. His achievement in unifying the disparate elements that had accumulated through centuries of literary development into coherent narrative provided future generations with authoritative treatment that preserved medieval understanding while making it accessible to changing cultural contexts. The legend's medieval period thus concluded with a work that successfully synthesized historical chronicle, chivalric romance, and spiritual allegory into unified artistic achievement that would define Arthurian tradition for centuries to come.